In its relatively brief history, the United States rose from a series of divided and disjointed backwater colonies into a powerful republic, and in a few ways a mighty empire, both as a home to several distinct people groups across a massive landmass, and as a power that holds supremacy over several other nations across the globe, influencing them with its culture, politics, economics, and geopolitical vision. The country's origins can arguably be owed to 3 ships, and not those of Columbus. I'm referring to the Mayflower, the Susan Constant, and the Carolina, along with their accompanying ships on each of their respective voyages. These 3 ships would plant the seeds that would grow into the pine, the sycamore, and the palmetto, Massachusetts, Virginia, and South Carolina. And from these trees, these First Nations to settle what would become the United States, came the branches that would grow and intertwine into the country we know today. In those days, there were many proverbial trees planted across the coast, and the colonies were a diverse landscape of different peoples and Christian faiths. But diversity often leads to struggles for supremacy, and in a matter of decades, it was clear the pines, sycamores, and palmettos had come to dominate their domains. The New Englanders, the Pines, were driven to the New World by the promise of religious freedom, or more precisely, the freedom and opportunity to carve out for themselves a land shaped by their religious belief in Puritanism, a highly moralistic, tight-knit, and congregationalist faith which birthed an extremely industrious and mercantile society along the coasts of the region, a Bible Commonwealth. The Virginians, the Sycamores, arrived in the New World under an independent company established by the king before being converted into a direct colony of the crown soon after. The colony grew into both a mercantile and agricultural hub upon the cash crop of tobacco, and unlike its northern counterpart, did not seek to build a wholly new society, but actively sought to transplant the traditions and practices of the motherland to Virginia. However, the nature of the settlers' new living conditions would soon reshape this, with the lack of development and difficulty of communication driving a need for decentralization outside of major settlements and eventually urban centers. The Carolinians, the Palmettos, had been later arrivals to the New World than their predecessors. While the territory of the colony had been sparsely settled previously, it wouldn't be until the emergence of the city of Charleston that the colony's unique character began to emerge. Yes, one based in mercantile trade, but with an extensive focus on agriculture, particularly upon the slave-based plantation system which had proven especially lucrative across the islands of the West Indies, Barbados in particular. And it is from this island colony that many settlers arrived in their new colonial home of South Carolina, a colony which, because of its imported Caribbean-style slave system, was more African than English, but whose slave economy allowed much of the English-descendant planter population to afford more luxurious lifestyles than their northern counterparts earlier on, attempting to emulate the opulence of the planter elite of Barbados and the Caribbean, much as the Virginians sought to emulate the elite of England. Other colonies of note include Pennsylvania, a colony established through a land grant from the King to William Penn, who made the colony a safe haven for monotheists otherwise outcast or sidelined in their homelands, primarily Quakers, though also featuring Huguenots, Mennonites, Amish, Catholics, and Jews. At the time, Pennsylvania would have formed the core of what are generally considered the Middle Colonies, but which in reality were merely the extended reach of Pennsylvania and remnants of previously defunct colonies across Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, and Lower New York, this area being notably more religiously and ethnically diverse than the Congregational North and Anglican South. Aside from Pennsylvania was New York, a colony initially established by the Dutch before seeing annexation by England. Much of the Dutch population remained and were afforded certain freedoms, but quite soon the colony saw the imposition of English common law and customs. In those early days, New York served as a bountiful provider of crop and lumber to Britain's other colonies. However, the British also appeared to see some potential in the development of New York into a hub from which to administer and control both the colonies of the North and South, though at least for the time this had not fully manifested. In the beginning, these First Nations lived in relative rivalry with one another, but all of that changed when the Indian Wars broke out. The earliest of these was Virginia's war with the Powhatan, who claimed right to the land upon which the settlement of Jamestown was established, and sought to attacking the Virginians, seizing their belongings, taking captives, and attempting to starve the settlers out, which in turn led the Virginians to retaliate with formal war. The wars between the Virginians and the Powhatan would span nearly 4 decades. The initial phase of the war severely backfired on the Powhatan. Instead of driving the Virginians out, the conflict had driven the Virginians further inland, annexing additional lands from defeated tribes. Though peace was brought, the Powhatan would retaliate again years later in the Indian Massacre of 1622, seeing to the killing of a quarter of Virginia's population in an unwarranted surprise attack. Powhatan affiliates sympathetic to the Virginians would provide them aid throughout this phase of the war, and once again the Virginians would expand their hold, controlling virtually the entirety of the Virginian Peninsula, across which they erected a barrier to deter further Amerindian attacks. But a final attack by the Amerindians would be launched years later, once again being crushed, seeing to the pacification of the region and the domination of the Virginians over the region. New England's war against the Wampanoag would follow. The New Englanders had long set about expanding their domain, and initially held positive relations with some of the local tribes, all of whom faced difficulty with the Pequot tribe, a warlike and expansionist population whose name was said to be an Algonquin word meaning destroyers. Smallpox had ravaged the population, eradicating an estimated 80% of the Pequots, but still they challenged their neighbors, and most dangerously, challenged the New Englanders, killing unarmed civilians and instigating an absolutely savage retaliation by the New Englanders in what became known as the Mystic Massacre. And while the Allied tribes participated on the side of New England, they now came to fear what the New Englanders were capable of. The Wampanoag in particular would grow increasingly frustrated with the New Englanders following what they considered infringements of their land rights and attempts to convert them to Christianity. The breaking point was the trial and execution of 3 Wampanoag men for the murder of an assimilated Amerindian by the name of John Sassamon. The motive for this murder having been that Sassamon had reported Wampanoag intentions to organize an alliance against the New England settlers. Under the leadership of Chief Metacomet, the Wampanoag and several other tribes began a raiding campaign against the New Englanders in what amounted to nearly 3 years of bloody violence between the two factions and their tribal allies. Thousands lost their lives on both sides. Over half of every New England settlement was targeted for attack. Towns were burned, tribes were virtually eradicated, atrocities were committed by all factions. And in the end, New England survived, scarred but in many ways stronger. Similarly, the South Carolinians faced the Yamasee and their band of shifting allies when, following an attempt to mediate disagreements between the tribes and the South Carolinian government, the Yamasee massacred the South Carolinian delegation and launched raids against colonial settlements. Over the course of the war, South Carolina lost hundreds of its citizens to Amerindian attacks, amounting to nearly a tenth of its population. The Yamasee were in turn scattered as a tribe, seeing them absorbed into what would become the Creek and Seminole confederations. The 3 colonies each faced and overcame these crisis wars which threatened their very survival, consolidating their sense of identity and their will to survive not merely as individual colonies, but as distinct people. Simultaneously, the surrounding tribes came to realize that they could no longer individually challenge the colonies and began consolidating into larger and more organized confederations. In time, the populations of the colonies grew and expanded, facing challenges from both the Amerindian population and the French who occupied the lands to the west. This struggle would reach its climax in what was known as the French and Indian War, which ultimately ended in victory for Britain and its colonies, effectively knocking colonial France out as a major threat to the colonies. However, while the colonials were enthusiastic for this outcome and for the potential land gains this victory could provide, Britain had taken to restricting colonial settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Beyond this, Britain, now saddled with a massive debt from its war against France, went about raising taxes upon the colonials to alleviate this burden. The colonies, which now felt that they had benefited significantly less from the defeat of France and also felt removed from European affairs, challenged these taxes with increasing fervor. Naturally, the colonies most affected by British taxation were those whose economies were most deeply steeped in mercantile trade, namely the colonies of New England, chiefly Massachusetts and its city of Boston, with New York and Philadelphia additionally serving as outside hubs of colonial resistance to royal power. The Sugar Act was among the first of these taxes, a policy to merely increase enforcement of a previously existing tax which the colonies largely skirted around. The tax was most intensely felt by the northeastern merchant class, who began pursuing boycotts and advocating for colonial self-sufficiency from British imports. But it wouldn't be until the Stamp Act that protests and riots from the white-collar and middle-class masses impacted by the increased taxes would begin to emerge, particularly within the city of Boston. Britain repealed the acts and issued a declaration asserting that the colonies were still a part of Britain and that the reciprocal relationship between the colonies and motherland obligated obedience from the colonies, but having long grown accustomed to essential self-government and feeling that Britain was too far removed from domestic affairs to govern the colonies effectively, the Northeast chafed under Britain's seeming demand for compliance, its attempts to resecure its hold over colonial politics, and its passing of the additional acts which would follow. Acts which again attempted to raise revenue, curtail smuggling, and properly enforce the tax laws the colonies were already obligated to pay. Very soon resistance emerged out of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, as well as in the merchant communities of Virginia. Hostilities were rising and conflict appeared inevitable. The colonials began coordinating amongst each other for what they believed would be a necessary unified stand against the crown, a demand for either greater autonomy or total independence. The Continental Congress would be formed, and following the battles of Lexington and Concord, it was clear independence would be the course followed. Now all that was needed was a commander-in-chief to lead the country to independence: George Washington. Washington was a native of Virginia, born to a wealthy family who was much bolder and more stubborn in his youth than he would be at the time of the War for Independence. He held early ambitions of becoming a great man, and would find his opportunity in the military, where he quickly gained notoriety and promotion for his delivery of crucial correspondence between the English and the French. This had only served to build up young Washington's ego, but that ego would soon be brought into check. Overestimating his abilities and acting on the poor advice of allied Amerindians who had incentive to foment conflict between the colonials, Washington haphazardly attacked a small grouping of French soldiers who immediately retaliated with reinforcements, capturing Washington at Fort Necessity and triggering the French-Indian War. Washington had become a laughingstock among the military and was facing the risk of demotion, as many now came to regard him as a reckless child who never should have been given the level of command he had. To spare himself that humiliation, Washington resigned from military command and recognized that he still had a lot to learn if he was to be an effective commander. He would find that opportunity serving as an aide to another general in a subsequent campaign, observing closely how he conducted himself and created battle plans. However, when his commanding officer was killed in battle, Washington was once again thrust into a commanding role, carefully and successfully evacuating his men from the disastrous battle. Washington's reputation had improved following this act of heroism, but he still faced criticism, and he himself had doubts about his abilities, and so resigned from military life entirely to assume a position as a planter and a popular politician. And it is here he really began to clash with royal policy, seeing how significantly British malgovernance was affecting colonial business and life, driving him to believe that greater autonomy was necessary. It wouldn't be long after that he would be selected to command the Continental Army against the Crown. Recognizing that he would not be able to effectively match the might and size of Britain's army, Washington launched an unorthodox campaign which forced Britain into frivolous engagements in which he could press his advantage if in fact he had one, or tactically retreat to further frustrate Britain's forces and force them to overexert themselves in the colonies. The goal was to exhaust Britain and to prove to them that just like their colonial governance, they did not care enough about the colonies to preoccupy themselves with a long drawn-out conflict. Repeatedly, Washington denied Britain the satisfaction of definitive progress and laid in wait for the opportunity to strike at large enough targets which could progressively diminish British morale. In the end, the War for Independence was won, and Washington retired his post to resume life on his plantation. What followed was the emergence of a new nation, the United States, though not as we know it today. For rather than a true union, this was an American confederation, one given shape by the Articles of Confederation and governed by the Congress of the Confederation. Very quickly, holes in the system of governance would begin to appear. The pre-existing differences between the colonies now states began driving them apart within their new confederation. The loosely established government was incapable of pulling the states closer together and forging a true union. Ironically, among the foremost issues facing the Confederation government was convincing the new states to pay off the new country's war debts, which the states resisted just as they had under Britain. The states stalled any efforts at trade and treaties, printed their own currencies, laws were disregarded left and right, the young country was on the brink of chaos. A new solution was needed, a new constitution to give shape to the new country. Under Washington's former military aide Alexander Hamilton, a convention was convened to forge a new country, a closely integrated federation led by an executive, and Washington would be that executive. Despite his initial hesitation, Washington was convinced by the representatives that he was the only man under whom the country could be united, and so he accepted the position. In 1789, the new Constitution went into effect, and Washington became the first president of the United States. But this reform did not come easy, for while it was clear the country needed federalism, there were also anti-federalists, individuals who challenged the notion of a strong centralized government and of a closer union in favor of principles of liberty and state supremacy. The leader of this movement was a man by the name of Thomas Jefferson, and though his views were dismissed as radical among his peers, conditions within the United States were shifting to favor his populist small government vision. Since at least the 1760s, the supremacy of the Anglican tradition in the South had been rapidly eroding, increasingly relegated to the upper classes, while the inland commoner populations, more numerous and spread out, saw a religious transformation which truly took off during the First Great Awakening. Having needed to adapt their religious practice to the circumstances of underdeveloped rural life, the interior Anglicans became far more congregationalist and were eventually absorbed into either the Baptist faith or the faith of Presbyterianism brought over to the Appalachian region by the Scotch-Irish settlers. While almost inversely, the stringent morality imposed by the New England Congregationalists paired with their higher levels of political centralization had given way to a more hierarchical philosophy, as the Congregationalists had essentially come to depend upon their control of government institutions to substitute the role of a central church authority capable of enforcing moral law. The South, fueled by this new religious orientation as well as by political writings written to appeal to the common folk and rural farmer, had quickly become a hotbed for decentralization, separation of church and state, and democratization, sentiments which, while still largely dormant for the time being, would fully erupt just years later. In contrast, the communities of New England and those along the coast, which had long stood as hotbeds for Congregationalism as well as Anglican practice, had come to develop their own form of policy. The Congregationalists of New England, having supplemented the role of a central church with a strong centralized government, came to favor political centralization, something which brought them into alliance with the pro-centralization Anglicans, now Episcopalians. While Washington commanded support from the country at large, the Hamiltonian or Federalist school of thought would remain almost exclusive to the Northeast and coast, which, aside from its religious uniqueness, was more heavily developed, mercantile, and aristocratic. Washington would give muscle to the national skeleton, establishing various offices, institutions, and precedents which would come to define the country for years to come. Beyond that, Washington successfully navigated 3 potential wars, seeing to the suppression of internal division and rebellion which could have undermined the power of the Union, asserting American control over the northwestern territories which Amerindian tribes loyal to Britain refused to acknowledge as being a part of the United States, and finally, Washington denied the French Republicans who pressured America for an alliance built on Republican anti-monarchical values and upon France's previous support of the colonies during the war. Especially given the fact the French revolutionaries did not represent the government which actually did render support to the colonists, that having been the French monarchy which the French revolutionaries overthrew. Washington had built the foundations of a powerful state, and the work he had begun would be continued by his handpicked successor, John Adams. The Adams administration would see to a raising of national revenue through taxation and investment in national institutions, most especially in areas of defense. The need for this militarization was a result of escalating tensions with revolutionary France, who in Washington's absence heightened pressures against the United States. Jefferson, sympathetic to the French Republican cause, would actively work as vice president to compromise Adams' peace efforts. The result of this escalation was the outbreak of the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval conflict with the French Republicans. Beyond this was a new rebellion in Pennsylvania against Adams' tax policy, as well as a rising fear among Federalists of rural areas seeking secession. Facing threats both foreign and domestic, most especially on the part of recently arrived immigrants, Adams sought to passing the Alien and Sedition Acts to better tackle matters of foreign influence and political sabotage within the United States. Unfortunately for Adams and the Federalists, the party was dividing along its more steadfast Hamiltonian and moderate Adams factions, many Hamiltonians feeling that Adams was not going far enough in his policy and allowing the Jeffersonians too much power. The Jeffersonians were in fact gaining in popular support, and with a majority of print media at the time in the hands of the Jeffersonians, not to mention Jefferson's strategic position as vice president, it seemed virtually inevitable that America would undergo a great change. In what became known as the Revolution of 1800, Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans had swept power away from the Federalists both in the executive and legislative branches. This would spell the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party, progressively losing more and more influence to the Jeffersonians. Jefferson was not like many of his peers. Having come from a highly academic background, Jefferson's fixation was upon ideology, philosophy, and more specifically a desire to promote a vision of agrarian egalitarianism, to create a truly free and equal society led by the land-owning farmer. Jefferson, of course, wasn't a farmer, but the lifestyle enchanted him, and he quickly grew to believe that it was only the farmer who was truly capable of being free, and only under his leadership that America as a whole could become a free nation. While the Federalists upheld a vision of order and unity, freedom and small government had been Jefferson's credo. Freedom from the oppression of monarchy, freedom from the control of an elite class, freedom from the constraints of a new constitution, or more specifically, taking advantage of the clause that all powers not delegated to the federal government were those of the states. Taking office, Jefferson quickly went to work, shrinking the size of the military and navy to a fraction of what it once was. Federalist policies were done away with, offices were dissolved, taxes were repealed, only facing resistance from the still Federalist-dominated Supreme Court, which Adams had taken to filling with Federalist judges in fear of what Jefferson might attempt while in office. By the end of Jefferson's reforms, the role of the federal government in the lives of the average American had essentially vanished. Of course, hand in hand with Jefferson's ambition of creating a society of self-sufficient farmers was opening up more western land for settlement. Jefferson had initially hoped to acquire territories along the Gulf of Mexico from France, however was offered a unique opportunity by France's Napoleon in the proposed sale of the entire Louisiana territory. Unable to pass up such an offer, the territory was acquired for a steal of a price. The United States had virtually doubled in size and seemingly assured the future of the country would belong to the land-owning common man. The defining feature of the subsequent presidential administration of James Madison was the War of 1812. The more anti-British approach adopted by the Jeffersonians since 1800 had led to increasing hostility between Britain and the United States, both on land and at sea. The British, caught in the midst of their war with France, began a policy of impressment and seizing sailors from American ships believed to be draft dodgers. Initially, this policy was extended to anyone who was born a British citizen, but this largely went unenforced during the Washington and Adams administrations. It wouldn't be until around 1803 that Britain once again resumed its harsh approach toward American sailors. The Madison administration took this as an undermining of American independence, and so used the matter of impressment as a casus belli to launch a war of conquest against British Canada, hoping to not only open up additional land for American settlement, but to further eradicate British influence on the continent. The war concluded in an uncomfortable stalemate that both parties were simply happy to be done with. The British were now able to return their focus to France and the European continent, while the United States basked in a sense of confidence in their ability to once again stand up to British power. However, the reality of the situation was clear to Madison. He and Jefferson had vastly overestimated American security, and Jeffersonian idealism alone would no longer be enough to ensure American survival. America needed a stronger military, it needed a stronger economy, and it needed a stronger executive. James Monroe, an essential disciple of Thomas Jefferson, would succeed James Madison and bring to the presidency the vision of Jefferson tempered by the life of Washington. Monroe came from a humbler background than his mentor, and unlike Jefferson, who exalted the simple, hard-working lifestyle of the farmer but never could shed his aristocratic habits, Monroe was a hard-working farmer. More than that, he was a soldier, a man disciplined by labor and by combat. For Jefferson, Monroe was his vision of what every American ought to be. Monroe would take power at an opportune time. The War of 1812 had turned the country against the pro-British Federalists, virtually obliterating the last of their support to the point that during Monroe's election for a second term, the Federalists were unable to field a candidate, leaving Monroe to run unopposed. The aftermath of the war had also left the country with a, quote, era of good feelings, the combined result of these factors essentially leaving Monroe with a degree of political influence unseen since Washington's administration. Under Monroe, tensions with Britain would be eased. Florida would be annexed by hero of the 1812 war, General Andrew Jackson. Some of the most significant investments in national infrastructure in years would be made. Monroe would navigate one of the earliest major hints of the North-South divide over the matter of slavery by establishing the Missouri Compromise and setting a precedent for the future expansion and containment of slavery in the United States, not to mention shaping the dynamic of state admission for the next several years. Perhaps most famously, Monroe took to adopting a clear policy of ambition for the Americas, framing the US as a leader and protector of republicanism and independence in not only North America but South America as well, across which various new states had recently achieved independence from Spain. This Monroe Doctrine took a stand against recolonization efforts by the European empires and was supported by Britain, who aimed to exclude France and Spain from regaining ground in the Americas. Like that, the United States began coming into its own as a solitary and fully independent power. But just as it appeared that democratic republicanism had won, the following election would reveal just how close the country was to its next great change. In a startling turn of events during the election of 1824, rather than seeing a single Democratic Republican run unopposed and claim victory, 4 men sought the presidency representing differing regional variants of democratic republicanism. Massachusetts and the Northeast nominated former Federalist John Quincy Adams. The party's establishment in the mid and southeastern states supported William H. Crawford. Henry Clay would emerge as a representative of the northwestern states, and General Andrew Jackson would see major support from the southwest. Jackson would emerge with a significantly higher popular and electoral vote than any other candidate, 41% over Adams' mere 31%, and easily surpassing the combined votes of Crawford and Clay, which totaled at only 23%. Jackson also carried 99 electoral votes over Adams' 84. But while Jackson was clearly the winner, he failed to achieve a winning majority of the total vote, and so a contingent election was held by Congress, and with Crawford's health failing him by that point, the government ultimately selected establishment member John Quincy Adams instead of the radical outsider that was Jackson. But this unique circumstance would not repeat itself come the next election, and if this election was any indicator, America was on the cusp of its next great change. Andrew Jackson had an upbringing unlike any president prior. His family was not of the well-established upper-class variety, but rather new arrivals to the colonies from the Irish province of Ulster. They would settle in the frontier lands of the Carolina border and live in relative poverty. Andrew Jackson would never get to know his father, as he died just prior to young Andrew's birth. This lack of a paternal figure to both provide for his family and offer proper guidance made Jackson an especially aggressive and bitter young man. When the War for Independence came to the Carolinas, Jackson's mother, feeling helpless to act and fearing harsh retribution by the British upon the colonies, encouraged her 3 sons to participate in the conflict for the sake of protecting their new home. Andrew's older brother Hugh would enlist in the local militia but would be captured and die in captivity soon after. Andrew and his still elder brother Robert would become couriers for the militia, and they too would be captured, young Jackson having his face slashed by a British officer for refusing to polish his boots. If not for the pleading of their mother and Andrew's young age, the two would have almost certainly died in captivity as their brother had, though unfortunately the tribulations of the Jackson family would not end there. The 3 would need to trek home 40 miles in unforgiving weather, all the while Andrew and his brother suffered from the effects of smallpox. Robert would die just 2 days later, and Andrew's mother would succumb to cholera several months later. At age 14, all of Andrew's immediate family was gone, and his distant relatives refused to house him, knowing of his unpleasant and troublesome character. It seemed Andrew was left to become a street urchin, unwanted and completely alone. But he did not let that defeat him. He took up a job as a saddle maker while completing his early education. He'd go on to apprentice in law, learning just enough to make it a profession he could live off of, and would begin building his reputation as an effective frontier lawyer who would often be paid in land and livestock. He'd eventually transform this into an impressive career, serving as a judge on Tennessee's Supreme Court, helping found the city of Memphis, and becoming commander of the state militia, not to mention a successful businessman and plantation owner through all the land he'd acquired and nurtured. Jackson would become a pillar of the frontier South and achieve national fame during the War of 1812, when his troops exacted revenge on the Red Stick Indians for their massacre of 500 at Fort Mims, earning Jackson the rank of Major General and giving him the duty of defending New Orleans from British invasion. There, Jackson would place the city under martial law, create army units for new black and native soldiers, and collaborate with French privateers, essentially pirates, in hopes of evening the odds against the invading British, who significantly outnumbered Jackson's forces. Jackson's defense would prove an overwhelming success, officially suffering only 60 casualties as opposed to the 2,000 suffered by the British. The war ultimately ended in stalemate, though because Jackson's victory came as the last major battle of the war, many Americans remember the War of 1812 as ending in an American victory. Post-war, Jackson would personally invade and conquer Spanish Florida for the United States, becoming the new territory's first governor before ultimately throwing his hat into the presidential race of 1824. Jackson, a lifelong Democratic Republican, had grown disillusioned with the party, which he recognized as growing too powerful, corrupt, and elitist. Jackson accused Monroe of forsaking the values of Democratic Republicanism, shedding its duty to the people, and becoming little more than a big government party which paid lip service to the masses. Jackson saw deep corruption and nepotism take hold in the party, with any detractors swiftly being booted out. The government had become a cesspool of self-interested politicians, and Jackson was going to tear it all down. Jackson believed in greater democratization than any of his predecessors. All free white men should hold the right to vote. The state should be mostly sovereign, but not above the Union. The executive, as the people's direct representative, should hold wide-reaching power beyond the limits of an elite Congress, and candidates for the 3 branches of government should be elected solely based upon the popular vote. The cost of this was simply total party loyalty from the individual and total state loyalty to the Union. Loyalty was very important to Jackson. It was often the decider of whether or not he felt freedom and power were deserved by a group or individual. The nation was built on a set of principles, and he expected everyone in power to abide by said principles, to always put the country first. Those who fell short of this were swiftly stripped of their authority or even threatened with execution if he felt they betrayed his trust and that of the country. Jackson was widely popular and dramatically outperformed his competitors in the election of 24. However, as we explained earlier, because this election had seen so many candidates vie for the presidency at once, Jackson failed to acquire a definitive majority of all votes, and the decision went to Congress, who, because Jackson was not part of the establishment and demonstrated both great ambition and personal will, was deemed too dangerous to be given the presidency. Like that, Congress, bloated with members of the decades-old establishment, robbed Jackson of his rightful victory so that they may still cling to their self-enriching status quo. So infuriated was he by this mass betrayal that Jackson insinuated Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House at the time, would hang for his theft of the people's vote. He returned home deeply embittered, but was nominated to run for president in the next election almost immediately. Knowing that he held the admiration of America's majority, he stood determined to boot Adams and the corrupt party out once and for all. And very quickly did the people get behind him, calling out every fault of Adams' illegitimate rule, crippling his and the party's reputation. The opposition would fire back, and in the build-up to the election, Jackson was the target of non-stop media hatred, with near slanderous stories accusing him of murder and cannibalism. Jackson certainly did retain the aggressive character of his youth and was quick to threaten those who crossed him, famously challenging an expert marksman to a duel for insulting his wife. Just to touch on that specific event, Jackson was shot in the chest but remained standing and attempted to fire his gun twice, successfully killing his opponent. The second shot is said to have been on account of Jackson's gun jamming the first time and would have technically been an illegal action, but dueling itself had been outlawed in Tennessee at the time and so the matter was never legally contested. The accusations of cannibalism, on the other hand, were simply fabricated. A line which perhaps should not have been crossed was when the media directed its attacks not at Jackson but at his wife, the later stress of which ultimately contributed to her death, leaving Jackson terribly angry. Despite this barrage of media hatred, Jackson, by scrutinizing Adams' regime and by appealing to the people as an American war hero, a self-made success story, and someone who began his life from the humblest of beginnings, was able to attract the largest voter turnout the nation had ever seen by that point. 17 percentage points higher than the previous highest turnout, and nearly double Jefferson's regime-changing turnout in 1800. Jackson was the people's president if ever there had been one. So proud was he of his popularity among the masses that he invited his supporters to the White House for a celebration following his inauguration. But once the festivities were out of the way, Jackson went to action. An investigation was launched into the government to root out any and all politicians guilty of defrauding the nation, manipulating elections, accepting bribes, and more. Hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars were uncovered, major accounting and anti-corruption reforms were passed, and over 900 officials were removed from power, replaced by patriots and political loyalists who Jackson trusted to fulfill their duties honestly. Today, Jackson's actions have been maliciously rebranded as a spoil system, in which we're led to believe Jackson recklessly dismissed qualified officials solely for the purpose of rewarding his followers. This is a terrible mischaracterization of a president whose actions purged the nation of a growing sickness when it appeared no establishment official could be fully trusted. Though to be fair, these actions did come at the cost of experienced office holders, but a skilled soldier is only a liability if you expect him to stab you in the back. Jackson went further by attempting to eliminate what he recognized as obstacles to total democracy. This meant attempting to abolish the Electoral College so as to make the popular vote the sole means by which a president was elected, as well as terminating the policy of appointing Supreme Court justices, making the position an elected office instead. Neither of these panned out, however. An institution Jackson identified as being a den of corruption and anti-democratic values was the National Bank, which Jackson saw as a tool of the extremely wealthy, deeply connected to foreign investors and possessing an unethical degree of influence over politics. After a long political battle, Jackson would decentralize the bank as well. This, along with his investigations into government spending, allowed him to fully pay off the national debt, a feat no other president has managed to repeat to this day. While Jackson had rooted out corruption and disloyalty at the individual level, such an issue now arose at the state level during what was known as the Nullification Crisis, when South Carolina refused to accept a tariff harmful to its local economy, soon threatening secession. Jackson's inner Federalists demanded of him that he take every action to preserve the Union. To him, the preservation of the Union remained a matter of loyalty. He allowed the states to do with their local governments as they wished, but every here and now he expected seamless cooperation between them for the national good. For South Carolina to reject national interest for its own benefit was, in Jackson's eyes, an act of grave insolence. Congress granted Jackson the right to use military force against the state if it became necessary, but ultimately the tariff was reformed to the benefit of South Carolina and the southern states in general. A miniature civil war was avoided, but Jackson could tell a tremendous divide between the North and South was growing that stemmed beyond mere geography. The cultures, economies, and politics of the two were dramatically different and would only become more so over time. In Jackson's own words, the tariff was only the pretext. Disunion and Southern Confederacy is their true goal. A quote which would foreshadow one of the greatest tragedies yet to befall the nation. Despite all these accomplishments, Jackson is perhaps remembered most for a long series of events which today have been simplified into the phrases Indian removal and Trail of Tears. Since the outbreak of the Creek War in 1813, the South had become a hotbed of conflict between native tribes and American settlers. Washington and others initially believed the best approach to coexistence with the natives was to either fully integrate them into American culture, or redraw borders to prevent the two cultures from violently clashing and competing for land. Washington would become disillusioned with peaceful coexistence following a lack of total cooperation from the tribes and continued aggression toward American settlers. Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans would again promote integration and find some success with members of the five civilized tribes as they were known. However, resistance to this integration would also emerge and lead to several attacks upon settlers by anti-integrationist natives. This deeply divided some tribes as progressive natives saw tremendous merit in American farming methods, house building, sanitation standards, and family structure, while traditionalists recognized this as a replacing of their culture and refused to follow the direction of their chiefs, many of whom had been the product of intermarriage between white Americans and red Indians, costing them legitimacy in the eyes of some purists. Members of the same tribes took opposite sides, and the larger Amerindian conflict became a tense and explosive culture war within the borders of the deep southern states. Recognizing that peaceful attempts at integration could progress no further, Jackson determined that only two options remained: separation or total war. A war which would see one side exterminate the other and leave the survivor badly worn. This outcome would be disastrous, especially given the Southern secession crisis which had occurred while the removal process was still ongoing. Instead of war, a new territory would be carved out of what today is the state of Oklahoma, making of it a territory exclusively promised to the natives, out of the way of present expansion plans and outside the borders of any existing state. By the terms of the treaties Jackson offered to the southeastern natives, they would receive a portion of land within this new territory in exchange for that which they currently possessed. They would be provided wagons to facilitate the migration, compensation for any possessions left behind, and assured a year's worth of food upon arrival. Most of all, they were promised peace and freedom to govern themselves as they saw fit, without fear of clashing with the white Americans. These promises of direct government support would only apply to those who willingly migrated within a matter of months or years. Alternatively, those who remained would be subject to the law of whatever state they resided in. Those well integrated into American culture would be free to remain, but those who resisted integration would be forced to migrate without the same guarantees earlier promised, seeing their land and property seized by the state governments. A majority of members of the Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes, recognizing that it'd only be a matter of time before they were displaced by the expanding United States, being geographically closer to the new Indian Territory and seeking to avoid war, willingly took up the offer immediately, and while the several day-long trek was arduous, many dying from disease both along the trail and upon arrival, these initial settlers were able to hold on to their wealth and possessions. Further, these groups were spared the years of hostility which would break out between the US and remaining Seminole, Creek, and Cherokees, of which approximately half voluntarily migrated. The Seminole were ultimately left to their own devices, though drastically reduced in number by the conflict, while the Creek and Cherokees were eventually driven out, though the latter was able to negotiate relatively comfortable terms of surrender, given the opportunity to purchase several wagons, a steamboat, and hire a number of doctors and laborers to accompany the remnant natives on their journey westward. While the total number of fatalities along the trek varies widely from source to source, it's safe to say that each tribe lost anywhere from 10 to 15% of its population during the entire ordeal, including the weeks immediately following each arrival. The grim nature of this event often overshadows the grander legacy of Jackson, painting his intentions as wholly malicious while amplifying a single frame of what in truth was a much larger issue which threatened the lives of those natives who managed to survive, threatened the lives of countless Americans in what would have been a horribly savage war, and threatened the very unity of the nation by forcing the southern states to reject federal authority and take the struggle for dominance into their own hands. Jackson was not one to twist words. He saw plainly that Indian removal had become a necessary evil to fulfill if greater tragedy and disunion was to be averted, a decision much like that made by another president only some decades later, when the survival of the nation would once again hang in the balance. Jackson would be succeeded by his second vice president, Martin Van Buren, an upper-class northerner who had his beginnings in the Democratic Republican establishment, but who held more closely to the original values of the party. He would join Jackson as his more moderate partner in building the Democrat Party as its own independent entity, feeling too that the Democratic Republicans had grown too powerful and distant from their Democratic roots. He'd prove a fairly tame president upon his own taking office, especially in comparison to Jackson, diffusing two potential wars and attempting to guide the nation through an economic crisis often attributed to Jackson's economics. And while some of Jackson's policies did exacerbate the issue, a significant economic downturn at the time was inevitable, largely on account of sudden changes in foreign demand for American goods and rising interest rates initiated by Britain. Despite this, the rumor of Jackson's full responsibility was circulated by the newly formed opposition party, a coalition of anti-Jackson Democratic Republicans and former Federalists, who felt as though Jackson had made himself an essential king through the tyranny of the masses. And so the anti-Jackson party adopted the name of the anti-monarchical pro-parliamentary party of England, the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House who helped deny Jackson his victory back in 1924. While Van Buren did well to maintain stability during his administration, his perceived lack of response to the economic crisis, rumors of Democrat fault for the crisis, and in general his more lukewarm character cost him a second term, handing victory over to the Whigs, who picked a candidate of similar military prestige to Jackson with ideological leanings favorable to them, William Henry Harrison. However, Harrison would famously die only 1 month into office, passing the mantle onto his vice president John Tyler, an independent Jackson sympathizer who kept the latter's momentum moving while stalling the Whig agenda until the presidency was eventually retaken by Jackson loyalist James K. Polk. Polk was a Southerner like Jackson and was sometimes thought of as Jackson's apprentice or protege, previously working with the president to pass his agenda through the House of Representatives and adopting many of Jackson's personal philosophies into his own life. After a brief term as governor of Tennessee, Polk came into the presidential office with what he called his 4 great measures, 4 major promises which he believed would strengthen the nation and his party. Polk would formally complete the annexation of Texas begun under Tyler, adding another Democratic state to the Union and solidifying Democrat control in the agrarian South. He vastly expanded land holdings to the western coast following the defeat of Mexico in the Mexican-American War and negotiation of the disputed Oregon Territory with Britain, gaining the support of expansionists as well as doubling down on his southern base by creating the opportunity for more slave states to emerge. Finally, he'd strengthened the national economy, but agrarianism in particular, by bringing tariffs to an all-time low. Aside from the overall drop in prices for foreign products, this allowed the South to cheaply import manufactured goods and thus focus on its agrarian economy, which, since the Jefferson presidency, had been championed as the ideal economic model of America. Likely borrowing from Jackson's belief, but lack of practice, that presidents should only serve a single term, Polk refused to campaign again, though this was no doubt further motivated by the toll presidential work had taken on his mental and physical health. He would die shortly after leaving office. The subsequent election proved a disaster for the Democrats, in part due to Polk's shift toward the South and inadvertently toward pro-slavery politics. Polk thought the slavery debate was divisive and unimportant to national health, but in truth it was a growing concern which had been building within even his own party, as its northern members generally held a negative opinion of slavery, though tolerated the practice as falling within the purview of states' rights, and thus not up to them but up to the Southerners to decide what to do with it. This did mean, however, that Northern Democrats would pursue policy favorable to the economy of the more industrial North, which at times conflicted with traditional Democrat agrarianism. This internal debate brought Northern Democrat ex-President Van Buren back to party prominence, running on an explicitly anti-slavery ballot which split the Democrat vote. Van Buren, once again and this time intentionally, handed victory to the Whigs who more openly opposed slavery than the Democrats, but still thought the subject was not worth inflaming national tensions over. Whig candidate Zachary Taylor had narrowly won thanks to a split vote and his background as a Southern general during the Mexican-American War, again demonstrating that the strength of the Whigs came from how much they could emulate Jackson's character without conceding to his ideology. He'd served just over a year before he, like the last Whig elected before him, died early, quite suspiciously I might add, from a stomach illness which some believe may have been the result of poisoning. He was succeeded by Vice President Millard Fillmore, whose presidency was relatively uneventful. He is perhaps the closest the Whigs officially got to a full presidential term, carrying forward a number of their federal agendas unlike the independent John Tyler, but compromising on matters of slavery to narrowly gain enough support for other Whig policies, only fracturing the party further along its northeastern and central state ideological wings, respectively the radical abolitionists who refused to compromise on slavery and the traditional Whigs who simply wanted to focus on national growth. These compromises have wrongly earned Fillmore the title of a Southern sympathizer when in fact he strongly opposed slavery on a personal level, but once again did not see it as an issue which demanded great urgency. He'd be succeeded by Northern Democrat Franklin Pierce, whose administration saw the North-South divide grow ever clearer. He entered office with the intention of running a typical course of steady improvements without any ambitious goals, not holding the most confidence in his suitability for the office at that point, but finding himself the preferred candidate among Democrats who believed his pro-Southern views and Northern upbringing would help unify the deeply divided country. However, they were terribly mistaken. It must be understood that around this time most Americans saw slavery as immoral and hoped to resolve it in some fashion. Largely only in parts of the Deep South was there a sense that slavery was morally justified and mutually beneficial to whites and blacks alike, or that it must be continued as a means of maintaining Southern power over the government. In polar opposition to those who justified slavery were the radical abolitionists of Lower New England, who demanded the immediate abolition of slavery and the integration of the freed population as American citizens. While many of us are perhaps familiar with the stereotype of the deep Southern plantation owner, often forgotten is that of the radical religious zealots of the Northeast, whose puritanical roots still shone through as they condemned slave owners and compliant Southerners as irredeemable sinners, while those who personally opposed slavery but remained politically neutral for the sake of national unity were deemed cowards or traitors. This particular demographic had emerged out of what were known as the Second and Third Great Awakenings, periods characterized by extreme moralizing and a demand for major political reform and social justice to be taken in the name of this revived religious morality. Enabled by sympathetic but much less radical groups like the Quakers of Pennsylvania, Scandinavian immigrants in the far north, the abolitionists were a relatively small group but one with significant influence and many allies. Perhaps the most infamous of these radical abolitionists is John Brown, who committed atrocities against pro-slavery individuals in the Kansas Territory, and planned for over a decade to stage an armed slave rebellion on the genocidal scale of that which was seen in Haiti, carrying delusions that he was chosen by God to become a new Moses and lead the slaves to freedom. Left to either the Deep South or Lower New England, both would have rather seen the Union die than to compromise on their positions. As far as either were concerned, you were either with them or you were with the enemy. Most Whigs and Democrats who had long seen themselves as representing not the North or South exclusively, but the nation as a whole, mind you, agreed gradual emancipation at the state level was key, as the Constitution restricted the influence of the federal government on state-by-state politics. Both sides also tended to agree that most of the free population should be relocated to a territory outside the US to prevent resentment and hostility between ex-slaves and their former masters. The key points of disagreement for the moderates of both parties were if slavery should be allowed to expand into newly annexed territories for the sake of a north-south balance but still fade out just over a longer period of time, or if it should be contained within its present borders and snuffed out at a quicker pace. For moderates, this debate had ultimately come down to politics rather than morality, as the Democrats, still then a party with national appeal, eventually found their base of support increasingly concentrated within the South. As Jackson feared, politics were following a geographic divide, giving the disgruntled Deep South a direct political platform, and that platform had become his own party. The Democrats, having been the faction of states' rights, agricultural tradition, and expansionism, naturally drew in the slave states who saw the Democrat platform as the surest means of preserving their status quo, what they recognized as the course Jefferson had laid out for them at the start of the century: agrarianism and decentralization, power in the hands of the free farm-owning man. But they increasingly felt that was being wrongfully taken from them. Originally it had been decided by President Monroe's Missouri Compromise that all western lands north of the 36th parallel, save for Missouri, would prohibit slavery, leaving only Arkansas Territory to become a viable slave state, as the US had yet to acquire Texas and the Southwest Territory. This seemed to create an expectation in the minds of Northerners that slavery had been permanently curtailed and could no longer expand. However, Polk's acquisitions changed that, and in fact inspired calls by the South for the acquisition of additional territories such as Cuba and northern Mexico so as to perfectly balance the north and southern states in terms of political power and representation. But almost immediately there were calls in opposition to repeal the Missouri Compromise and outlaw slavery in the former Mexican territories as well, angering many Southerners who personally participated in the war against Mexico, expecting additional southern lands to allow the practice of slavery. The Taylor administration would hint at Northern willingness to break the Missouri Compromise upon the rapid granting of statehood to California, on the condition that it adopted an anti-slavery constitution. He had hoped to do the same with New Mexico as well before he mysteriously died. Later, Fillmore would pass what was known as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 as one of his compromises with the South, an almost superfluous piece of legislation had it not been for the actions of the abolitionists, who repeatedly violated not only the terms of the Missouri Compromise but the Constitution as well, both of which provided that if a slave were to escape to a free state, the officials and citizens of that state were legally bound to return that slave to their owner. As you might imagine, there was very little compliance even after the Fugitive Slave Act introduced punishments for aiding escaped slaves or refusing to return them. This is something that we need to look at from the perspective of the time period to really understand how significant it was to the escalation of North-South animosity. Today we recognize the immorality of slavery, and it's easy to say helping the slaves escape was the right thing to do, thus dismissing the entire event. So instead, imagine yourself being repeatedly burglarized for tens of thousands of dollars each time, roughly what a single slave would cost. And it's also happening to your neighbor and his neighbor and so on. You found the people responsible and they still have what they stole, but the local authorities of the community they live in refuse to arrest them. And the government who explicitly said they protect you from this is doing nothing. That's where the seeds of disunion really began to sprout. Once the Southerners realized the government would not and could not help them and they would need to take matters into their own hands. Likewise, Northerners resented the government for telling them that they had to return to slavery the people they tried to help. And as you might imagine, they became violent about it. Both sides did. Now where does that bring us to? The Pierce administration. You took the nation at perhaps its most volatile point since its victory over Britain, and you placed it in the hands of a man who himself didn't feel ready for the office. With California set as a free state and the future of the remaining Southwest up in the air as tensions were ready to explode, Pierce moved to officially repeal the Missouri Compromise, but this time in favor of the South, providing them an opportunity to make of Kansas a future slave state to balance out the inevitable free state of Nebraska, but only if they could sufficiently settle it with enough pro-slavery citizens. This had been part of his attempt to appease the radicals on both sides of the slave debate, but unwilling to concede ground, the abolitionists and emancipationists flocked to Kansas in great number so that they may claim it as a free state and rapidly tilt the national balance of power, beginning a many years-long conflict within the Kansas territory known as Bleeding Kansas. Before he left office, Pierce asserted that it would not be the fault of the North or South if the Union were to be dissolved. That responsibility he claimed belonged to the abolitionists, who alone saw the nation not as a union but as half free and half slave, the righteous and the sinful. And true to his pro-Southern views, he argued that the Deep South had become far more defensive of slavery because of the abolitionists' radical rhetoric. And certainly they did, though we might still expect, as evidenced by Jackson's experience with South Carolina, that the Deep South would still remain a resistant force within the country even in absence of the abolitionists, though the potential for civil war would have dropped significantly and likely seen the Upper South remain aligned with a more moderate Union as had almost occurred. By the time Buchanan took office, the pieces he held were irreparable. The last in a line of Northern Democrats, he, like those before him, proved a political disappointment, attempting to appease both the North and South, tucking the slavery debate under the rug to avoid divisive politics, earning nothing but the resentment of both sides before he decisively threw his lot in with the South, attempting but failing to define Kansas as a slave state, while also attempting to annex Cuba and northern Mexico to create new opportunities for the South to rebound. Though more ambitious than his predecessor, there was little he could do by the time he took office. Even his own party had fractured, something he did not help. Tearing at the seams, it appeared as though America was approaching its next great change. Thomas Jefferson left a tremendous impact upon the United States. His Democratic Republicans essentially demolished and replaced the Federalist foundations established by Washington and the Continental Congress before him. But Jefferson's vision soon schismed along economic, ethnic, and environmental lines. Whereas the agricultural South prioritized Jefferson's teachings of agrarian democracy, so did the Anglo-German industrial North embrace Jefferson's belief in egalitarian republicanism, to the point that even their foundational mythos began to diverge. In the North, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, in particular the phrase "all men are created equal," became a greater beacon to rally around than the Constitution itself, the document which actually gave political shape to the country. This created debate over whether the United States truly began in 1789 when the Constitution officially came into effect and Washington assumed the presidency, or in 1776 when the US declared its independence, the two documents becoming rival totems which no longer signified unity, but the northern and southern visions of what the nation truly was. This debate went even further, arguing over which original colonial settlement was truly responsible for creating the United States, the southern settlement of Jamestown in Virginia or the northern settlement of Plymouth Bay in Massachusetts. The former held claim to the first instance of democracy in the future country, while the latter boasted divine virtue, arriving in the New World to worship God, unlike these southern colonists who arrived as profiteers and introduced slavery into the would-be country. As the Deep South rallied behind the Democrat Party for its pro-state, pro-agrarian platform, so did many in the North then without a party seek to establish a faction which more expressly represented their historic and present demands. The direction of a strong and unifying central government as promoted by the Federalists, one which could take action to promote a uniform religious morality at the national level. Greater equality across the races and genders as had been interpreted from Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. And a pro-industry and infrastructure platform that complemented their particular economy, as had been favored by the Whigs. Many had initially placed their faith in the aforementioned Whigs, but as we've already gone over, that party proved too moderate, too opposed to geographic sectionalism, and too internally divided to achieve real change. Though in all fairness, both parties of the time had become more divided than their Federalist and Democratic Republican predecessors. Martin Van Buren's earlier breakaway from the Democratic Party had seen the creation of the Free Soil Party, but its platform largely revolved around the single issue of preventing the expansion of slavery, and thus was doomed to a small following. The collapse of the Whigs just prior to Buchanan's election allowed much of its remnants and those of these smaller parties to be absorbed by the emerging northern-focused Republican Party. With its rise, Jefferson's Democratic Republican Foundation had finally broken into the Democrats of the South and the Republicans of the North. The Republicans did not shy away from sectionalism. They recognized that the Democrats had shown where they stood and who they preferred. Whether intentional or not, they were the party of the South, just as the Republicans must act as the party of the North and of freedom over slavery. There now stood, including California and Oregon, 18 free states against 15 slave states, with the free states alone carrying a winning number of electoral votes. There was no longer any need to pander to the slaveholders, no need to pander to agrarianism or to states' rights. The Republicans represented the institutions of the North and its long-term vision for America. Free reign to expand national infrastructure, free western land for those who could settle it, and freedom from the shackles of southern servitude. For the first time since the rise of Jefferson, power had dramatically shifted from the central and southern states back to the North where it was expected to remain, and for many in the South that proved an intolerable reality straight on the horizon. The Republican Party's first attempt at the presidency would prove a failure, as candidate John C. Fremont carried an unreliable reputation and was even seen by some in the North as a radical. Though that being said, he still received a fair deal of support, reassuring the Republicans that they could win the following election if they chose their candidate wisely. That candidate ultimately being former Whig and increasingly popular orator, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln grew up very modestly in a log cabin which sat upon some farmland tended to by himself and his family. Simple folks who typically got by on the bare minimum and saw greener pastures both in regard to work and in the literal sense, moving to Indiana from Abraham's native Kentucky after having lost a great deal of their land in a legal dispute, which the Lincoln family couldn't afford to contest. Just 2 years after the move at age 9, Lincoln would lose his mother, only for his father to remarry soon after, adding 4 more people to their small household as this new wife had brought over her children from a previous marriage. Eventually, the greatest burden of work would be placed upon young Abraham's shoulders, as his father's poor health left him less capable of completing his typical work, leaving Abe to work tirelessly upon his own farm and the farms of others, just to make ends meet. The young Lincoln soon came to resent his father and dreamed of escaping to a more respectable life and profession, for unlike his simple parents who could not afford to even consider education, Lincoln knew deep inside that he was capable of far more than laboring in the dirt from sunrise to sunset, and he hungered for knowledge that could help him better his place in the world, spending his few moments of free time to read and write, sometimes even shirking his chores to do so, something his father, who some have claimed was illiterate, would punish him for. Abraham would ultimately leave that life behind him and never look back, it being said that he only spoke to his father once more from the day he left to the day that his father died, Abraham neither inviting his father to his marriage ceremony, nor visiting him on his deathbed. We might assume that this laborious upbringing and sense of needing to escape the simple life imposed upon him by his father made Abraham sympathetic to the slaves of the South, believing that they too deserved an opportunity to thrive on their own and never look back on the difficulties of their past lives. Abraham would begin anew in a small community in Illinois, and it was here that he began making money for himself and emerged as a pillar of the community. So respected did he become that he was encouraged to run for public office, and though this initial attempt had fallen flat, he aggressively took to studying politics and public speaking in between jobs, throwing his hat into the ring for a second time just 2 years later and emerging victorious. Despite barely having any formal education, he'd very effectively teach himself law and not long after acquire his license to practice, further developing through this occupation a strong sense of justice and the ability to mediate. He'd become both a prominent lawyer and statesman, joining the Whig Party and becoming deeply fascinated with the teachings of Henry Clay, adopting many of his political beliefs including protectionist and pro-industrial economics as well as government investment in national infrastructure. He'd briefly shelve his political career after being offered an unglamorous promotion by Zachary Taylor, but would observe the escalating national tensions of the period from the sidelines before ultimately returning as one of the loudest voices against disunion. By that point, his old party had fallen into ruin, and he was immediately sought out by the Republicans for his powerful speeches and widespread appeal as a former Whig, moderate, a self-made man both strong and intelligent, and an expressed believer in the containment of slavery. He'd become the Republican candidate of the 1960 presidential election, and with every free state coming together behind the Republican Party, while the Democrats fractured along northern, southern, and Union lines, his victory was virtually assured, but for the Deep South, this outcome was unacceptable. Lincoln had publicly promised that he held no intention of outlawing slavery in the states where it presently existed. That was beyond his jurisdiction as president. He only sought to prevent its spread to additional territories and ensure that the nation moving forward was on a course toward greater freedom. But after years of what felt like betrayal from the federal government, Democrat and Whig alike, after years of Northerners trampling upon laws the South repeatedly compromised for, and after years of being told now by the faction in control of the nation that they were sinful heretics, simply evil for doing what they had been legally doing since the country was founded, well, the South simply had enough. In their eyes, the North had repeatedly expressed its desire to disenfranchise the slave-owning South, and now with Kansas and Nebraska soon to become 2 more free states, along with the Southwest, that disenfranchisement had been achieved. A century of existing conjoined to the dominantly Anglo and German-American North demonstrated how incompatible their value systems were. Jefferson had promised them, the farming class, that they were the nation's future, not the urban elites and religious Puritans who believed they understood freedom best. The South rose to national prominence and remained there after thoroughly defeating the elite North Anglo-Federalists, and in that time their own values flourished, only stumbling whenever Northerners attempted to represent them, or when they compromised with the belief that their opponents would keep their word. Refusing to continue this partnership with those whose views had become irreconcilable with their own, the South moved to secede, beginning with the state that challenged fellow Southerner and Democrat Andrew Jackson all those years ago, South Carolina. For Lincoln and for the majority of the country, the preservation of the Union was far more important than the question of slavery, and so several attempts were made to reach a new compromise which might revoke the secession or at least encourage additional states considering secession to remain within the Union. Lincoln offered forgiveness and protection to the seceded states, ensuring them that he would enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and further enshrine constitutional protections for slavery where it presently existed. But remembering how poorly compromise had worked for them in the past, the South rejected the offer and secession continued, giving rise to the Confederate States of America. Lincoln warned that he would protect all federal assets within claimed Confederate lands, such as that which ultimately initiated the Civil War, Fort Sumter. The fort was situated in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, and while not a tremendous threat to the city itself, could have been used to attack shipments to and from the city. More than that, it stood as a challenge to the Confederacy's ability to enforce its sovereignty from the United States. It was, however, running low on supplies, and abandoning the fort to the Confederates became a serious consideration. Despite discussions between South Carolina, the fort, and the Union which hinted at the possibility of a peaceful surrender of the fort or a resupplying mission, the decision was made by the Confederacy to attack Fort Sumter and seize it by force, giving Lincoln the necessary justification to initiate military action against the rebel South. The Civil War would last 4 years and consume the majority of Lincoln's first presidential term, bleeding into his re-election. He'd attempt to prevent additional states from seceding, finding success with Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, but the act of declaring war upon several southern states brought Arkansas and Virginia to secede as well, who in turn contributed to the secession of North Carolina and Tennessee. The loss of Virginia had cost Lincoln the support of Colonel Robert E. Lee, whom Lincoln had intended on promoting to Major General and hoped that he would lead Union forces to a speedy victory as General Winfield Scott's successor. Without Colonel, later General Robert E. Lee, Lincoln went through a handful of military commanders, none of whom proved both effective and cooperative. Despite the Union's superior numbers and resources, breaking the Confederate line proved incredibly difficult. That is, until General Lee's plans were leaked to the Union, allowing for the tides to finally be turned. Command would eventually fall to General Ulysses S. Grant, a more ruthless military commander who unleashed heavy destruction upon the South in order to deprive them of any resource and asset they might exploit, even at heavy expense to his own men. Lincoln has been criticized for having appointed Grant to his position of power despite his actions. However, by this point, Lincoln was becoming incredibly desperate for an end to the conflict. He'd heard tell of so much bloodshed that he began to question why, if God intended for this war to have a victor, did he not simply decide and end it already? On a similar note, Grant saw the Civil War as divine retribution against the United States and the South especially for having declared war upon Mexico in what he believed was solely the pursuit of expanding slavery. This in turn allowed him to feel justified in the harsh actions he took against the enemy. Lincoln saw on the horizon, if the previous pace was to continue, an endless war of attrition for the essential reconquest of the South. Even once the fighting officially ceased, he did not expect the Southerners to forgive this attack against them, and surely, if not sooner than later, they would rebel once again if they possessed the means to do so. Lincoln's decision then was to inflict a devastating blow upon the South, but then take personal responsibility for their recovery. A disciplinary action to remind them of Union strength, followed by an apologetic embrace reminding them that they are still family. Grant would ultimately defeat Lee, and while Lee's men insisted he continue fighting, the Confederate general refused to allow further destruction to befall his fellow men, his home state of Virginia, and the rest of his country, North and South alike. General Lee's surrender would essentially end the conflict as his had been the primary theater of the war. Lincoln, who had just earlier won re-election, the first president to do so since Andrew Jackson over 3 decades prior, was optimistic. As calls from his party grew and the war's end created a unique opportunity to end what had been the most divisive policy in the country, Lincoln, no longer feeling bound by his pre-war promise of the South, abolished slavery across the country via the 13th Amendment. Acceptance of slavery's abolition, along with a pledge of loyalty from 10% of each southern state's population, became the criteria under Lincoln for reintegration of the individual Confederate states into the Union. Post-war, the southern states were placed under military rule, but reintegration would restore typical government operations. Lincoln had a direct hand in rebuilding the governments of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee, each of which proved highly successful and satisfactory to a majority of those states' populations. Former Confederates, save for their upper leadership, would be granted total amnesty and have their political rights restored upon their oath of loyalty to the Union. This outcome proved too liberal for the radical faction of the Republican Party, a small but influential lot who repeatedly opposed Lincoln for his moderate Whig background and demanded greater privileges and securities for the freed black population, along with harsher punishment for the South. The radicals of Congress, led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, had existed in a power struggle with Lincoln, coming to recognize the executive office as a hindrance to their agenda, repeatedly seeking to undermine executive and even judicial authority through the establishment of independent government institutions such as the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War, utilizing the committee to discredit or remove any military officers suspected of holding Confederate sympathies, a label which was attributed for as little as calling for a tactical regrouping, retreat, or essentially anything which wasn't a reckless grand-style head-on charge at the enemy. The result was a replacement of skilled West Point officers with inexperienced, politically driven, or naive officers, which, as you might imagine, led to greater casualties on the Union side. The Radicals attempted to interfere with all aspects of the conflict, especially post-war Reconstruction. They exemplified the northern extremes of the North-South cultural divide in their view that there was no Union, there was only the moral, industrious free North and the exploitative, backward slave South. Two entities tragically bound together, one of which was dragging the other down. The Radicals saw the South as a lesser entity, something to be conquered, colonized, and utterly reorganized at the social, economic, and political level. Stevens, and to a lesser extent Sumner, believed that statehood should be stripped away from the southern states, their citizens, save for the freemen, deprived of their constitutional rights and ability to vote, while new northern settlers prepared the southern territories to be reintegrated as states with new populations more receptive to northern ideals. Lincoln disagreed. He didn't believe the Southerners deserved such conditions, nor that they would tolerate them, that such measures would only give legitimacy to Southern desires for independence from a government which sought to subjugate and erase them. Lincoln's primary concern and objective in the build-up to, during, and following the Civil War was to ensure the survival of the Union. That meant forgiving the South and rebuilding national brotherhood now that the bitter subject of slavery was done away with. This demanded a process of reconciliation, rehabilitation, and reunification, not punishment and domination as the Radicals desired. And though slavery as an issue was resolved, still remained the divisive question of the freedman's role in America. He was now free to live as his own master, but could he do so in the same nation which had once held him in servitude? And was he to be an equal citizen or relegated to a second-class role? Should it be left up to the individual states to decide? Would this be the beginning of a new national debate that ultimately ends in sectional violence once again? Lincoln himself was concerned that the freed population would not only inflame and become victim to severe discrimination, but that they would, with their limited skill sets, slave upbringing, and historic tension with the white South, ultimately have negative effects upon the national economy and national sense of unity. Following in the footsteps of his role model, Whig leader and former president of the American Colonization Society, Henry Clay, Lincoln determined, as most moderates in the antebellum period had, that the most moral and effective solution would be to establish a colony exclusively for the freed population in which they would be beyond the threat of racial persecution and free to pursue a national agenda in their own best interest, much as Jackson had arranged for the natives during the Indian removal. Lincoln had ordered investigations into various colonial prospects across Central America, South America, Africa, and the Caribbean, but several issues stood in the way, notably the ongoing war. Although it's been suggested by some that Lincoln was eventually talked out of colonization by abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who insisted that the freedmen should remain in America, this theory depends almost entirely upon Lincoln not having publicly written of any new colonization plans following that meeting with Douglass late into his first term. Despite the fact that around the beginning of his second term, Lincoln had once again opened up discussions of colonization with multiple members of his inner circle, suggesting that the gap of discussion on the subject was merely to avoid any divisive talk in the build-up to the critical 1864 election. The Radicals were infuriated with these proposals, but most moderates and of course the Democrats threw their support behind Lincoln. After years of destructive war, the North and South needed peace, not further conflict. All the while, many Northerners remained hesitant to simply allow the majority of newly freed slaves to remain in the South, where they might incite racial hostility or become victim to it themselves. Worse yet, if they were to migrate en masse to the North, where they would either put out of work low-skilled laborers or become a public expense by not being able to find work. Lincoln put these concerns to rest, and nearly all but the extremes of both parties appeared satisfied. Tragically, before Lincoln could set these resolutions in motion, he'd be assassinated by one of these very radicals. Not a Republican, however, but a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, shattering the country's last best chance for reconciliation, and bringing an end to the Age of Lincoln before it had even begun. Abraham Lincoln never truly had the privilege of serving as a peacetime president, nor did he have the opportunity to shape a political era of his own. He was a vestige of the dead Whig Party, the last and greatest of that faction to ever serve as president, though he did so as a Republican. The Republicans who, upon his untimely death, betrayed his legacy to seize power for themselves. With Lincoln gone, the moderates hoped his vice president, Andrew Johnson, would prove a respectable replacement, and though he aimed to fulfill the wishes of his predecessor, he lacked the finesse and admirable authority which Lincoln carried. During Johnson's speech campaign meant to drum up support for fellow Democrats and moderates in the midterm elections, he proceeded to tarnish what reputation he had by falling into the traps of Republican hecklers, making of himself a laughingstock and tilting public support in the opposite direction. The Radicals would win major gains in the election, and the Republicans would now hold a two-thirds majority in both houses, enough to override Johnson's vetoes and carry forward their Reconstruction agenda unhindered. The president was left essentially powerless. Congress made clear that as executive, his one authority was simply to execute the legislation they brought before him, and if he didn't, they'd still proceed regardless. The South, previously placed under the authority of governors appointed by the president, was now placed by Congress back under military rule following fears that under current conditions, traditional Southern politicians might return to power and seek to restore slavery or reignite rebellion. The states were divided into 5 military districts, each led by a general who was subject to the authority of radical Republican loyalist Ulysses S. Grant. And through the use of the military, the black population would not only be free, but given the right to vote, at a time when many whites had been politically disenfranchised for participating in the Civil War. This apparent fixing of the South's elections left many to consider the newly elected governments illegitimate. The radical Republicans saw this as a necessary measure to prevent a Southern resurgence, but this only inspired greater resistance to the heavily one-sided and at times incompetent government, one which drew in new opportunistic arrivals from the North, seeking to northernize the South and make a profit off the cheap war-torn land. The oppressive military presence, exploitation of Southern land by Northern elites, and manipulated election results ultimately spawned a hostile reaction from the South in the form of terror and insurgency groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who saw themselves as freedom fighters in the war against an occupying enemy, pulling the post-war North-South divide ever wider, just as Lincoln had feared. What many have called the nail in the coffin for presidential authority during this period was Congress's attempted and nearly successful removal of Johnson from office over a relatively minor issue, which had only existed because Congress had successfully overridden one of Johnson's vetoes of a law meant to protect one of their allies. Essentially, Congress made a law because they expected Johnson to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Johnson tried to have the law thrown out, Congress overrode the decision, Johnson proceeded anyway, and Congress came just one vote short of removing the president from office, only for the very same law to be deemed unconstitutional decades later. While Johnson survived this incident, he would not be re-elected, but instead see replacement by the congressional Republicans' ideal figurehead, someone who would be a perfect face for the federal government without challenging the actions of Congress behind the scenes. The most popular man in the country at the time, but one utterly unfit to hold the office, General Ulysses S. Grant, the president under whom began the longest-lasting and most widespread epidemic of corruption in the country yet. In the 8-year span of Grant's presidency, Northern industries and businesses developed close partnerships with Republican politicians. Politicians across both parties began making extensive use of backdoor deals for purposes of increasing their own personal wealth and power. Government secrets now had a price to any speculators interested in where the economy might move. The nation's monetary reserve was plundered, even in spite of the already terrible debt which had multiplied 40 times since the outbreak of the war. The South had become the playground of rich Northerners who could afford to buy it, while the freedmen's votes kept them in power for little more reason than party affiliation. And at the same time in the White House, several of Grant's inner circle, military friends, and family members whom he appointed to government positions became embroiled in their own corruption scandals, Grant actively protecting them when these scandals finally came to light. Many have called Grant a naive man, one whose honesty, trust, and lack of political knowledge were exploited by bad actors around him, and Grant himself had argued as much. However, Grant certainly wasn't so blind as to not realize how bad things had become. He had even openly expressed his desire to curtail corruption, but only made little success in doing so, and again protected his allies when they were ultimately exposed. When many of these individuals who profited off corrupt deals, sold sensitive information, pushed paid-for agendas, and attempted to cover it up were Grant's own friends and family who, again, he appointed and actively protected from punishment, then there is good reason to be suspicious of Grant himself. Corruption aside for now, during the Civil War, many of the natives within the Indian Territory, having been slaveholders themselves, allied with the Confederacy, and in doing so, Lincoln argued that they had nullified the protective treaties with the United States which had been provided by Jackson. Lincoln had seemingly hoped to apply similar treatment to the tribes as had been applied to the South, amnesty in exchange for an oath of loyalty and abolition of slavery. However, under Grant and the Radical Congress, the lands of the 5 civilized tribes were significantly reduced to make way for additional Indian and non-Indian settlement as Western expansion continued, eventually paving the way for the outright abolishment of the Indian Territory and establishment of the state of Oklahoma. The sovereign status of the natives as independent nations within the United States was suspended, ending the policy of negotiating with the natives via treaty, while the old policy of assimilation was once again adopted. New conflicts would break out between the United States and various native tribes across the West as a result of further encroachment and the perception of assimilation policy as an attempted destruction of native culture. Grant would readmit the remaining non-integrated states to the Union and restore voting rights to the majority of Southern whites during his third year in office. However, by this point, a new Republican establishment had become rooted in these states, though gradually it appeared it was being chipped away. The House of Representatives would return to Democrat control midway through Grant's second term, and begin an investigation into the administration's corruption, all the while pushing back against Northern influence in the South. Although all the former Confederate states had rejoined the Union, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana remained under military occupation. A significant degree of fraud occurred within those three states during the subsequent presidential election of 1876, and a following dispute over who to award the contested votes to ultimately led to a compromise. Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes would receive the votes and become president. However, the federal military occupation of the South was to be ended, the Southern states would be given full authority to govern its black population as it saw fit without federal interference, and a Southern Democrat was to serve in the new presidential cabinet. Two other conditions which would have strengthened the Southern economy were also proposed but never fulfilled. With that, a new period in the Republican age began. The radicals had gradually died out, losing support from the moderates who had grown tired of the anti-Southern and pro-freedmen rhetoric, simply wishing to put the nation back on track. The South would retain control of the House of Representatives but took to focusing on their local affairs, emerging from Reconstruction as a united voting bloc, the Solid South, and remaining as such for the following 10 presidential elections. All the while, the largely Republican presidents gradually regained their lost executive authority and attempted to control the corruption that had become so widespread and now threatened to make of America a plutocracy, a shell of a republic covertly run by the nation's most wealthy. For 3 decades, politics would follow this trend, while socially the country was transforming. Although the North and South had remained culturally divided whilst harboring additional divides within their own regions as well, the nation was becoming increasingly strung closer together by an ever-expanding network of railroads available to even the common man. The Northerner could travel south or the Southerner to the north in just a matter of hours or days. Both could travel westward to the opposite coast in a fraction of the time it would have taken otherwise. Business was no longer being conducted on merely a state level, but now on a national scale. Urbanization was occurring at a rapid pace, cities now able to become ever larger as commuting times, whether from within the city or from neighboring towns, were made far more convenient. The train brought to prominence other major industries which employed many more low-skilled laborers. If you wanted to produce more trains and tracks, you would obviously need more steel, copper, lumber, and iron. You'll need fuel, like coal and oil, thus giving rise to the captains of industry. While some were less principled than others, and a great lot certainly used underhanded tactics, these men, for better or for worse, became major players on the national scale, impacting policy, influencing politicians, transforming the economy, and creating a new social order. Hayes' successor, James Garfield, would proceed to tackle some of the corruption plaguing the nation before he was assassinated by a crazed aspiring politician. Garfield's successor, Chester A. Arthur, continued the crusade against corruption and cronyism, even despite having come into politics thanks to the patronage system. Seeing an increasing influx of Chinese immigrants since the first emergence of major settlements along the West Coast, around the same time that the national population was rapidly rising and finding employment for freed blacks was still a major concern, Arthur would see to the suspension of Chinese immigration for a 10-year period, while also barring from entry any immigrant who might become a public charge. Immigration from the majority of Asia would eventually be banned, and many Chinese Americans ultimately chose to return to China after feeling increasingly discriminated against, shrinking the population back to less than 0.1%. Arthur did not intensely pursue a second term on account of his failing health, and instead fellow Republican James Blaine was nominated. However, the Republicans stood divided. Following the fall of the Radicals, Republicanism found itself torn between two major issues: patronage or meritocracy. Should politicians be allowed to favor their loyalists and risk the creation of greater corruption, or should they act purely on the basis of merit and risk losing political influence? The severe scale of corruption occurring at the national level left many to favor the latter option, but Republican candidate Blaine carried a lot of controversial baggage, having been involved in a number of corruption scandals. Democrat candidate Cleveland, on the other hand, was widely known as a staunch opponent of corruption and promoted his honest character in the build-up to the election, very narrowly winning by less than a percentage point, and becoming the first Democrat to hold the office of presidency since James Buchanan. Cleveland would carry out the old states' rights tradition of the Democrat Party by reducing responsibilities taken up by the federal government and delegated them to the states and citizens, seeing that federal authority, especially that of Congress, had been widely expanded since the Civil War and risked exceeding its constitutional scope if the American public grew more dependent upon Washington and in turn willingly surrendered more power to it. He'd also peeled back the industrial protectionism first initiated late into the Buchanan administration. Cleveland's justification went back to the old agrarian Democrat support for low tariffs, as well as his belief in free trade. Despite running for a second term, he was defeated by Republican Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of Whig President William Henry Harrison, the one who essentially served none of his term. Benjamin Harrison generally continued the policies of his Republican predecessors, restoring the protectionism curtailed under Cleveland, rooting out corruption in politics and picking up greater momentum for continued American expansion, something which largely faded away for a time but which was slowly being revived now that the policy held no obvious risk of tilting national power one way or the other. Harrison's protectionism, though rooted in good intentions, ultimately cost him re-election to Grover Cleveland, who won a non-consecutive second term, the first president to do so. All these administrations built up to significant returns come the presidency of William McKinley, who witnessed the beginning of America's emergence as not merely a powerful and united country, but the unchallenged leader of the Western Hemisphere. The previous few presidents had gradually been building up America's navy, which had been neglected and outdated in the years immediately following the Civil War. But now, thanks to the greater interconnectivity of the nation, rise of industrial labor, and a new bounty of manufactured materials to draw upon, stood as one of the most powerful navies on the planet. Economic prosperity was on the rise, but still corruption existed across the private sector, bleeding into political affairs. The later presidents of this era had done well to clean up much of the corruption originating within the government, but still it wasn't enough, as monopolistic companies held tremendous sway over individual politicians and kept themselves secure by playing to the political interests of the time. This created a rising divide within both parties, but in the Republican Party especially, of those who sought to represent the successful businessmen of America, the country's best and brightest, and those who sought to represent the common laboring man who had no voice but his vote. Despite McKinley's assertion that America must, quote, avoid the temptations of territorial aggression, investigations were quietly being made into South America, Central America, and the Pacific, seeking out potential partners and strategic assets which might help the US secure its position in the Americas from the rising imperial powers of Germany and Japan. Hawaii had been a major consideration for both Cleveland and Harrison, recognizing its significant potential as an outpost from which to both guard the western coast and to project its influence into the Pacific through military and trade. McKinley would proceed to promptly annex the island chain. Panama was a chief territory of interest as well, particularly for the possible construction of a canal linking the Pacific to the Atlantic, allowing for speedy coast-to-coast transport by not only rail but by ship. Construction of such a canal had been of major interest to Britain and the other European powers as well. As such, failure to secure a canal for the United States could see this crucial asset fall into potentially hostile hands. Finally came Cuba and Puerto Rico, long-held territorial ambitions of the US which could help secure American dominance of the lucrative Caribbean, opening up access to valuable sugar plantations and other tropical crops. It'd be here during the Spanish-American War that a titan of a politician would make a name for himself, personally volunteering his assembled regiment of men to fight and conquer for America. He'd become McKinley's vice president come his second term, but the president would not live to see it very far. However, in death, McKinley would help trigger America's next great change. America's Gilded Age was a new height of prosperity and power for the country, a new age fully embodying merits and faults of its own. The country had fully defined itself as an industrial power. The national population had grown to an enormous size both naturally and through the importation of new immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Scandinavia, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe. Rail lines now connected through high-speed transit the furthest reaches of the states and the states with one another, creating a population and economy that was all the more integrated, allowing it to function as a single unit more effectively than ever before. The Navy was rebuilt and expanded, colonial lands were acquired, quality of life reached a new peak, new cities grew and thrived, several aspects of business, politics, and society were boiled down to a science and made as efficient as possible, countless new technologies were pioneered, the list goes on. But this progress came at a cost, both upfront and in perpetuity. America did not simply stumble into this clear path to follow. It was something which it bitterly fought to achieve against the wills of an opposing future, a fight which was in fact against itself. It was only through the utter defeat and disenfranchisement of the strong-willed rival agrarian South that the North Country was able to finally plot a clear course for the Union as one thing or the other, putting an end to a decades-long debate. The North and South, virtually since their inception as colonies, stood in conflicting rivalry, and upon the emergence of the United States, contended for power to determine whether America would be more akin to a centralized federation or a decentralized confederation, whether it would be isolated or interventionist, meritocratic or democratic, industrial or agrarian. The Civil War and the Reconstruction that followed snuffed out Southern political power, leaving Southern governments in the hands of only those explicitly sympathetic to the North until the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes. Lincoln's death had eliminated the most efficient and balanced leader of the virtually unopposed and utterly insurmountable Republican Party, allowing its worst elements to take control. On one hand were the political radicals intent on crippling the South further. This vision went as far as desiring the reduction of the former Confederacy to a colonial territory of the United States. On the other hand were corrupt officials intent on exploiting the post-war one-party nature of the country to enrich themselves at the expense of the nation as a whole, but especially the South. During the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, a man deeply lacking political experience and highly sympathetic to the radical agenda, the radicals and corrupt acted with near total authority. Corruption reached the highest levels in American history and permeated nearly every institution of government before surging in the business world as well. Corruption became the foremost issue plaguing the nation following the end of Reconstruction, something not at all helped by the unprecedented wealth being accumulated by business moguls of the time, which allowed them to influence politicians at an unprecedented rate. It was once said that every industrialist of the time had at least a couple representatives in their pocket, and the impact of this certainly shows in how much these companies were able to get away with unhindered, both by politicians and by the competition. One could argue a benevolence to these arrangements, however, of business and government growing closer for everyone's betterment, ensuring that only the best businesses thrived and made progress without interruption, as once again much achievement was made with a great deal of thanks owed to these industrialists, a great many of whom took up the banner of philanthropy, a philosophy of actively dedicating one's successful business to advancing the common good of society in one way or another, using that position of power responsibly. However, there were certainly those who explicitly acted with purely selfish intentions, whose so-called philanthropy was little more than a political agenda which at times countered the agendas of other so-called philanthropists, not to mention those who produced little for the state, exploited its resources and citizens, and generally made life harder for the common American. Many politicians felt that some things could be excused for the greater good, but ultimately these excused transgressions piled up because a line was never drawn, and if it was, there was little enforcing it. The dire state of corruption across the country, which was increasingly being exposed by the growing journalism industry of the era, paired with the carrying over of religious and social puritanism that dominated the northern states in the build-up to the Civil War, led to demands for reform that grew louder and louder. American society was in desperate need of progress and purification. Pollution, corruption, poverty, disorganization, alcoholism, crime, and more were all touted as injustices of the time that needed radical solutions. The rise of efficiency as a social movement, or Taylorism as it's sometimes known, demonstrated that scientific practices when applied in a business, political, or social setting could significantly cut back on waste, faults, loopholes, etc. It was determined that the faults of society were in great part attributable to social or governing systems not accounting for certain factors, and that if they were taken into account and resolved at their root, you could theoretically eliminate a great deal of social ills by depriving them of the opportunities that would allow them to thrive. In essence, if you can identify the root causes of poverty and eliminate or alleviate them, you can dramatically reduce poverty. There was no problem, social, economic, or political, which was beyond solving. Information simply needed to be acquired through thorough observation, and various solutions put through rigorous testing to find the single best possible way of doing something. This movement, paired with the heavily moralizing culture of the Protestant Northeast, led several individuals to begin applying the scientific problem-solving method to not only their businesses, but to themselves and their communities as well. A culture of self-improvement, of holding oneself and others to higher standards, began to take off, going beyond the merely religious and activist angle which predominated Northern culture prior. In essence, the Northern crusade to build a richer, more efficient, safer, and more just society wasn't just carrying on, but taking on new life. Gradually, through the efforts of determined politicians and an increasingly scrupulous public, the government cleaned itself up. But the transgressive actions of big business continued largely unchallenged by politicians, either limited in their ability to enforce law over these entities, or unwilling to compromise the delicate balance between business and government, overreaching government power into the realm of private enterprise. That is, until the rise of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was born to one of New York's most prominent families and remained under the close guidance of his father of the same name. The elder Roosevelt was a strict but very respectable man. He held exceptionally high standards of physicality, achievement, and virtue for himself and for others, most especially his family, bringing the younger Roosevelt into a life of rigorous fitness and study, even in spite of his frail health in youth. It was this strenuous life which in fact allowed Roosevelt to overcome his ailments and grow into a promising young man. It motivated him to improve upon his weaknesses when they were exposed, rather than attempt to conceal them. His father's stern virtue inspired him to always act in line with his morals, and never succumb to the temptations of wrath, idleness, deceitfulness, and greed. Take care of your morals first, your health second, and finally your studies, the elder Roosevelt would advise. This philosophy propelled young Roosevelt from homeschool to Harvard University, but following his father's death and the receiving of his hefty inheritance, he was presented a new crossroad. Up until this point, he had been underwhelmed by the university education he was provided, feeling as though it could not tackle the subjects which truly fascinated him with the same intensity as home education did and which he could now provide for himself. Initially, he had intended to continue his studies and pursue a scientific career, but now considered what better use he could put his time and money toward. The passing of his father and the legacy of public service he had left behind ultimately drawing young Roosevelt toward law and politics as a means of honoring and continuing his father's work. Roosevelt's post-graduation years would be dynamic to say the least, bringing him to serve as a New York Assembly member, live the life of a frontier hunter and rancher, and become a successful writer before ultimately going back to New York City to once again resume his political career. He'd rise from assemblyman to a federal position on the Civil Service Commission, an anti-patronage agency that had gone largely underfunded and underused if even it was used at all in prior decades. Roosevelt used his position to enforce merit-based political appointments, crack down on corruption, and carried his job out so well that he was reappointed by the Cleveland administration despite his support for the opposition. He would later lead the Council of New York City's police commissioners and institute systematic reforms that brought new levels of order and organization to the city's police force, making it the most efficient in the entire country, ushering in an era of law and order in the streets of the city, and raising the standard of policing to new levels before leaving to serve as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where he contributed to the decades-long buildup of naval might before resigning to directly participate in the Spanish-American War in a volunteer cavalry regiment he had established himself, feeling especially moved to ensure American victory in the conflict and expel the Spanish from the continent. Volunteer groups like Roosevelt's Rough Riders were particularly valuable during the war, as America's army was at the time the smallest land army of any major power, standing at less than 40,000 men. Relations had largely cooled with Britain, and save for some minor colonial possessions held by France, the Dutch, and the Danes, Spain was the last European power with a major foothold in North America, one which the rising and more threatening German Empire might have attempted to acquire given its recent interest in the Caribbean and in South America. Roosevelt's Rough Riders achieved great fame for their boldness and valor, which in turn made Roosevelt a national celebrity upon his return to New York, where he was encouraged to run for the governorship, ultimately mustering a victory. This executive position at the state level provided him a wider scope and understanding of politics and of the level of corruption within New York State, leading him to become increasingly weary of big business, most especially its impact upon the environment and upon the working class. However, like many of his positions before, he would serve for less than 2 years before moving on to something greater. That greater role would be the vice presidency, which upon the tragic assassination of President William McKinley, thrust Roosevelt into the highest executive office in the country, an office he would continue to hold upon being officially elected for another 4 years in 1904, receiving the highest share of the popular vote since the election of Andrew Jackson. The political movement of reform and efficiency which had begun at the local level was finally brought to national power, as a man born of the era took his place at the Capitol, ready to usher in a new age, an age of progress. Roosevelt was well in tune with the sensibilities of the day. They had, after all, helped shape him into the man he was. America had several ingrained problems at its societal, economic, and political levels, which demanded firm authority to resolve. And unlike his predecessors, he would not shy away from utilizing that authority to its greatest abilities. He perhaps best exemplified this in his stating that, quote, "When I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and of reward for equally good service. Because, and again I quote, if on this new continent we merely build another country of great but unjustly divided material prosperity, we shall have done nothing." Like many of the day, Roosevelt believed that the average American ascended beyond the immoral drives which led to a tyranny of the masses, or at least that through proper education and upbringing, most could achieve a level of self-governance and guide the state in the proper direction. There were, of course, outside and deviant factors which compromised this. Criminals, the insane, and the hyphenated or unintegrated American immigrant, whose loyalty remained split between his country of origin and the United States. Roosevelt was particularly of the belief that immigrants who refused to fully integrate into American culture would at best never be truly American, thus creating a deviant subculture out of line with the national majority, and at worst actively operate against the interests of the country for their own benefit and the benefit of their home culture. This sentiment was shared by most progressives of the day, identifying un-Americanism among citizens as an aberration which compromised their vision for a streamlined, cooperative, and efficient society. We'll see significant manifestations of this all throughout the Progressive Age, from the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan to acts of anarchist terror by Southern and Eastern European immigrants, the persecution of German Americans during the Great War, not to mention a rise in national racial tension as a substantial black population migrated from the South to northern cities during this period. But for Roosevelt, the chief deviancy he sought to eliminate immediately upon his entry into office was that of corruption and exploitation. He made expansive use of the Sherman Antitrust Act previously established during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison to aggressively regulate businesses through legal suits, issuing more lawsuits than all of his predecessors combined since the Antitrust Act was established. Further, he would establish a bureau tasked with investigating businesses and ensuring that they are operating according to code. This bureau eventually being expanded into the Federal Trade Commission by another progressive of this era just some years later. Investigations into the meatpacking industry would also be ordered following a rise in public outcry over the purity of foods, especially those transported to and consumed in major cities. The unsanitary practices revealed by the Neil Reynolds report, as well as concerns by scientists over the toxicity of preservatives used during the time, led to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Theodore would go on to promote and establish several new regulations primarily through executive order, issuing a then unprecedented total of 1,081, nearly as many as every president before him combined. Of his over 1,000 executive orders, a great number of them were dedicated to land preservation. Roosevelt held a deep admiration for the natural beauty of the country, most especially its hardy, untamed frontier, and sought to preserve parts of it for future generations to appreciate, as well as for sustainable use in national projects, giving said resources an opportunity to replenish and continue providing for generations. Roosevelt's exceptional domestic policy was matched by his foreign policy, seeing to the projection of American might across the continent and beyond. To achieve this, he had continued the buildup of the country's naval power, which had begun in the last few administrations, making it the foremost navy in the entire Western Hemisphere and the third most powerful in the entire world. Perhaps most famously, Roosevelt facilitated the construction of the Panama Canal. Agreement to the canal's construction had been repeatedly stalled by the dysfunctional and warring conditions within Colombia, which Panama was then a part of. The Panamanians, being separated from mainland Colombia by the treacherous and inhospitable Darien Gap, had sought independence some 80 times since their union with Colombia not even a century prior. Seeing an opportunity as tensions were flaring up once again, just as Colombia had backed out of a canal deal they had previously negotiated, Roosevelt, in exchange for rights to build the canal, hindered Colombian efforts to subdue Panama's independence movement. Roosevelt gave the Republic of Panama immediate recognition, and the construction of the canal began. This acquisition would produce one of the most valuable waterways on the planet, providing ships, but American ships especially, a speedy route with which to travel between the Atlantic and Pacific, further contributing to the integration of the national economy, enriching the nation, and bolstering the country's naval strength. Roosevelt brought America to a new level of prestige and power on the international scene, mediating peace between a warring Japan and Russia as well as between other major powers, keeping foreign influence out of the continent, enforcing order in the chaotic states of Central America and the Caribbean, and ushering in a new age of progress. Having served a full term as well as the majority of what would have been McKinley's second term, Roosevelt refused to campaign again, instead promoting William Howard Taft as his successor. Taft, like Roosevelt, was a progressive, albeit a more moderate variety, and certainly more mild in character. He had a respectable legal career behind him and served closely within the Roosevelt administration as Secretary of War, though he largely acted as a mere legal advisor to Theodore, hoping he might eventually be appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Beyond this, Taft was rather unremarkable, only benefiting from the fact that Roosevelt believed that the two of them were well on the same page, while in reality Taft may have simply been agreeing with him for the sake of staying in his good graces, a theory supported by the fact that he had become something of a flip-flopper when it came to policy later down the line. Taft hardly even took his own presidential campaign into his own hands, very often deferring to Roosevelt for the right thing to say. Despite these shortcomings, Taft did in fact win the election and began a fair continuation of Roosevelt's policies. He would oversee the passing of the 16th and 17th Amendments, the first of which allowed for the creation of a national income tax, something which had only previously been implemented by the Lincoln administration as a temporary means of funding the Civil War. The 17th Amendment further democratized the government by allowing citizens to directly elect senators rather than have them appointed by the individual states. This original process was intended to provide an additional level of merit and seniority to the senatorial position, as it was assumed that only those most respected and most capable would be selected by the state's elected representatives. However, many believe that this facilitated the creation of a corrupt elite, and that corruption would disappear if power was handed to the many instead of the few. But of course, as we've seen before, this line of thinking is a gross oversimplification with faults of its own. Taft even outshined Roosevelt in his use of the Sherman Antitrust Act by bringing nearly twice as many lawsuits against corporations in half the time that Roosevelt had. Where Taft and Roosevelt truly diverged was on matters of conservation and foreign policy. Taft was far less willing to use military might than Roosevelt, opting instead to utilize financial pressure, arbitration, and the building of codependencies with allies and partners as a constructive approach to foreign policy. Though that being said, this did not stop Taft from pursuing military action in Central America when instability arose in multiple countries and threatened American interests there, especially now that Mexico had fallen into revolution and these threats loomed immediately across an unstable border. Conservation was the bigger issue for Roosevelt, however, as Taft saw Roosevelt's reserving of massive swaths of land through executive orders as unlawful and requiring the full approval of Congress. Roosevelt's conservation efforts were further threatened when Taft saw to the replacing of two key conservation officials from the previous administration. Taft's administration would then proceed to free up some 3 million acres of previously reserved land for private use. This, along with questionably unprogressive rulings made by Taft's judges, of which he appointed quite a few, was enough for Roosevelt to fully break with his handpicked successor and attempt to replace him as the Republican frontrunner in the following election. But by this point, Roosevelt had strayed too far from the Republican establishment, who would much rather back the less radical Taft. Denied the Republican nomination, Roosevelt ran a third-party ticket and took with him a massive swath of the Republican voter base, defeating Taft in the popular vote by 5 percentage points in the election of 1912, while carrying 10 times as many electoral votes. However, this was not a victory, not even close. The split Republican-progressive vote had opened the gates for a dark horse candidate to seize victory by sheer chance. Carrying only 42% of the popular vote, there was little hope for this candidate to claim victory had the Republican ballot not split as it had. But it had. The split vote earned Woodrow Wilson an overwhelming 435 electoral votes, carrying all but 8 states by default. Wilson was only the second Democrat to be elected to the presidential office since the Civil War, and the first Southerner to hold the office since that conflict. Wilson had been only 5 years old when the Civil War broke out, and his birth state of Virginia had been at the forefront of it. Fortunately for him, his family had migrated to Augusta, Georgia shortly after his birth. However, Wilson was not fully sheltered from the effects of the war. Augusta, because of its housing of the Medical College of Georgia, became a major medical center for injured Confederate soldiers, seeing medical tents and temporary facilities raised all across the city to accommodate the wounded. This reached a significant height during Sherman's campaign across the state, when the city not only saw an influx of injured soldiers, but mass waves of refugees from destroyed cities, putting tremendous strain on Augusta's already dwindling resources. The war left a lasting impression upon young Wilson, and while he rarely spoke of those days, he would throughout his life indirectly allude to its impact upon him. Despite these strained beginnings and not performing well in his early schooling on account of dyslexia, which allegedly left him unable to read until age 11, Wilson would excel in his personal studies, overcome his handicaps, and become an avid reader, writer, and historian who would go on to study at Princeton University, exploring a legal career briefly before ultimately settling upon history and political science. Study was his passion, but he would also discover a knack for leadership and management, taking great pride and pleasure in his ability to organize events and coordinate group activities with his fraternity, sports teams, and friends. At age 27, Wilson pursued a doctorate at Johns Hopkins, which he would acquire and utilize to become a professor at Princeton, earning a reputation as one of the university's greatest instructors before ultimately being appointed president of the university by Princeton's Board of Trustees, some of whom held valuable political connections which eventually encouraged him to run for governor of New Jersey, then one of the most corrupt states in the country. Wilson was himself a progressive Democrat and appealed to progressive sentiments in that he wasn't a politician but an intellectual, one renowned for his organizational skills and who was unlikely to be swayed by big corporations. This did not so much matter to those who elevated Wilson, however, simply hoping that his unorthodox character might be enough to swing the election in Democrat favor, and that his inexperience in politics would make him easy to manipulate. Wilson's progressivism would in fact win him the election, but he would not allow himself to be swayed. The academic Wilson took a back seat, while Wilson the leader took charge. Almost immediately, Wilson broke up the corrupt political establishment of New Jersey through the passing of the Garand Bill. Schools across the state were now held to new standardized regulations, ensuring that the quality of education was held high. And of course, new antitrust laws were enforced and workers' protections were established. In only a few years, Wilson had thoroughly reformed and cleaned up the state, earning him much national acclaim. Wilson was a political darling to Northern progressives and to Southern traditionalists alike, making him the prime Democratic candidate for the 1912 presidential election. Of course, we know how that turned out. Contemporarily, Wilson is regarded by some as one of the worst presidents in US history, which is why it is so shocking that not even merely in comparison to Taft, Wilson is perhaps the truest successor to Theodore Roosevelt's legacy in the entire 20th century. Nowhere in American history have two presidents been so similar in ideology and arguably even in practice, yet held in such contrasting regard. Even Roosevelt himself could only criticize that Wilson's foreign policies were too liberal, yet found much of Wilson's domestic agenda in line with his own. As president, Wilson upheld and expanded conservation, including seeing to the creation of the National Park Service via the Organic Act. He'd established the Federal Trade Commission as a more capable and independent successor to Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations, tasking it with a wider scope of investigating corporations to ensure compliance with regulation. Taft's 16th Amendment was put to immediate use via the issuing of an income tax on the top 3% of earners, while reducing tariffs by an average of 14%, and in turn bringing down prices for a majority of the country. Women were given the right to vote via the 19th Amendment, the Sherman Antitrust Act was bolstered to expand its authority over other anti-competitive practices which previously slipped through the cracks, and Wilson laid the foundation for the 8-hour workday through the Adamson Act, as well as took the first federal-level step toward outlawing child labor. He even took Roosevelt's same position on hyphenated Americans as the Great War began in Europe. Arguably, Wilson had the most productive progressive administration yet, but his reputation was muddied by a number of other factors. Roosevelt carried forward a policy which saw America as a competing equal of the great powers and one which had interests to secure and protect by any means necessary. Militarism was an admirable trait of a nation and demonstrated strength which kept rival great powers at bay. Further, the country had a duty to project itself into neighboring lands and keep the continental neighborhoods safe and clean. Wilson, in contrast, was an idealist and something of a pacifist, aspiring to establish a future in which destructive wars were avoided, disputes over land resolved diplomatically, and lands of distinct culture given the right to self-determination, matters which would form the basis of his peace proposals during World War I. He strictly opposed Roosevelt's colonial and imperial ambitions, seeing it as unbecoming of a republic and plainly un-American. As such, Wilson attempted to mend relations with Latin America and foster collaboration with the Pan-American states as an alternative to the American interventionism which had been resorted to in the past. These idealistic visions were dashed, however, as Latin America continued through severe instability, and both Mexico and Colombia refused cooperation. The Mexicans becoming especially troublesome as the effects of the revolution were spilling over across the border, forcing Wilson to take action against them and multiple other countries in Central America and the Caribbean. This would see the escalation of the border war with Mexico, occupation of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, as well as intervention in Honduras. The creation of a central bank was a top progressive agenda and one which Roosevelt himself had set in motion through the establishing of the National Monetary Commission, and it was under Wilson that the bank was finally established. The national economy was not what it had been a century prior. America was in fact now a world-class nation and moreover the largest economy on the planet. It demanded greater organization of and control over its own money to make the most effective use of it, and prevent it from being dominated by a select few private banks. The intention was to create a more effective banking system which placed monetary power in the hands of the government instead of in the hands of private bankers, but almost immediately upon its creation attempts were made by said bankers to use the central bank as a tool of their own. The Reserve remains the subject of great criticism as it exists in a strange position of being publicly and privately controlled, as well as maintains an appointment system susceptible to corruption by an elite few, as only member banks and the President with the confirmation of the Senate can make appointments within the institution. Wilson also oversaw the passing of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, perhaps better known as the enacting of prohibition at the national level. In line with the progressive ideal of shaping a better society free of deviancy, crime, and waste, alcohol was fiercely campaigned against across the country for decades by this point. Anglo and Protestant elements were the chief champions of prohibition at the state and local level, in sharp contrast to Catholic, Irish, and German elements, the latter of whom's influence was significantly diminished across the country by World War I. Seizing upon anti-German and consequently anti-alcohol sentiments in the country during the war, national prohibition was brought before Congress and passed. Wilson was a believer that the end of alcoholism needed to come gradually and preferably at the state level, but not only did prohibition become law at the national level, the Volstead Act set a high standard for what was considered an intoxicating liquor. Most dry states of the time had focused on banning particularly strong liquors such as distilled spirits, but exceptions typically existed for lesser alcoholic drinks. That would no longer be the case with this new federal order. And despite the great enthusiasm at the federal level, little effort was invested in actually enforcing prohibition by the federal government, while local governments generally dialed back their own enforcement efforts, not strongly supporting the new law and feeling as though it was now a federal responsibility instead of theirs. And of course there is the matter of the Great War. For its first few years it had remained a largely European conflict and the United States merely played the role of an offshore manufacturing center. The demands of the conflict by both sides had reinvigorated American manufacturing industries, which could provide valuable resources the warring powers could not afford to produce themselves. American industries grew to accommodate the greater demand, and both manufacturing and agricultural output rose dramatically. This isn't even mentioning the many loans taken out by the European powers that would leave them indebted to the United States for years. As the war dragged on, however, the European powers were growing desperate and sought a tide turner to bring an end to the stale conflict. Wilson had campaigned on keeping the US out of the war, but when faced with what appeared to be repeated provocations and violations of American neutrality by Germany, saw that arbitration could go no further and thus war was finally declared. An enormous expansion of the army was undertaken and American forces arrived in Europe to supplement the Western Front. Germany's surrender would come just a little over a year later. Wilson saw the war as a conflict with no truly righteous faction, just two rival forces competing for something the other possessed. He took little solace in defeating Germany for the benefit of the Allies and promoted a perpetual mutual peace instead. Borders would be redrawn not to accommodate the desires of bloated empires, but to provide for the distinct peoples and cultures which inhabited those lands. Free trade and free navigation of the seas would be established for the purpose of ending petty squabbles over access to desired markets. Demilitarization to a level that would prevent the destruction facilitated in this and other recent wars would be undertaken, and the states of the world would come together as an association, union, or league for the purpose of ensuring their mutual security and preventing of conflict through the mediation of disputes. This was Wilson's vision, and it was a contributing factor to Germany's acceptance of the peace. However, it was not fully realized, as the Allied powers refused to compromise, debate over the outcome increased back home, and Wilson's health took a turn for the worst. His presidency came to an end with his post-war ambitions left incomplete and increasingly unlikely as the days wore on. Refusing to allow his work to go unfinished, he attempted to run for a third term, but was denied the nomination on account of his ill health. A very capable progressive was lined up on the Democrat ballot, however, but the election, arguably tainted by Wilson's bringing of the US into the war and promoting of an internationalist future, went to the Republican nominee instead, a compromise candidate by the name of Warren Harding. Harding came into office with the agenda of returning the country to pre-war normalcy, and although it was not explicitly stated, he sought to restore a degree of pre-progressive normalcy as well. He was an old-fashioned Republican and took a much weaker stance on social and political moralizing. Such a turn from progressive policy was quite appropriate for the time as well, as the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had left many Americans concerned and skeptical of organized labor, while it was felt that big business had been for the most part cleaned up. Union membership had even declined as a result of Roosevelt and Wilson's reforms making the work environment all the more fair. Wages were higher, conditions were better, and the quality of product was the best it had yet been. Simply put, as far as finances were concerned, it was a relatively prosperous time. As a result of all this, many wanted a break from the turbulent and experimental progressivism of years prior. Harding cut taxes and raised tariffs once again, wound back business regulations, and appointed individuals sympathetic to big business to major regulatory agencies, as well as initiated a major demilitarization of the country. Perhaps the most progressive policy to come from Harding's administration was the passing of the Federal Aid Highway Act, which set in motion the creation of America's expansive highway system to accommodate what Harding described as the emerging age of the automobile and of other technological innovations. Radio was becoming more ubiquitous, automobile ownership reached new heights, eugenics came into prominence with the promise of building healthier, more efficient families, and aviation was taking off as a technology with tremendous applications both commercial and military. Harding would only serve about 2 years of his term before passing away from a heart attack and being succeeded by his vice president Calvin Coolidge, who would win a full term in the following election. Coolidge continued Harding's deregulation, tax-cutting, tariff-raising, and demilitarization, bringing the country back and away from an international focus to an inward focus instead. Corporations, retaining many of the standards earlier established but no longer constrained by antitrust policy, resumed monopolistic practices and eliminated competition in the name of efficiency. After all, if everyone is under the same business and there's no competition to force you to change your strategy, you're free to advance your industry in the one best direction without any distractions. Perhaps Coolidge's most significant piece of legislation was the Immigration Act of 1924, which set a proportional quota of immigration based on the population already present within the US so as to preserve the country's ethnic makeup for the foreseeable future. Coolidge would be succeeded by Herbert Hoover, a prominent businessman, philanthropist, engineer, and veteran of the Wilson administration, who had strived to bring progressivism back to the presidential office. Hoover had taken it upon himself as Secretary of Commerce during the Harding and Coolidge administrations to pick up the slack of other officials who were embracing the president's more lax attitude toward regulation. This had led some to jokingly refer to Hoover as a shadow president or the Secretary of Everything, and while it irritated some establishment Republicans, Coolidge especially, these pragmatic and active efforts of his ultimately endeared him to the progressives who missed the days of a more active leader like Wilson or Roosevelt. Meanwhile, his background as a businessman left the upper classes confident that he would understand their practices well enough to not push radical policy. Hoover believed in a mutual balance of workers, businesses, and government all doing their part for their shared benefit, and with the economy appearing to be on the rise, he'd have the perfect environment to experiment with this system. Little did he know, however, that was all about to collapse, and create the conditions necessary to usher in America's next great change. Theodore Roosevelt had set in motion a new age in America, a progressive age of strong government, responsible business, moral discipline, and expanding interventionist ideals. The industrial nation had swept away decades of corruption and inefficiency to create a truly world-class state capable of participating in global affairs as an equal among great powers. The effects of progressivism reached a peak during the Wilson administration with such events as the prohibition of alcohol, the institutionalizing of greater trust-busting measures, and of course, the American entry into the Great War. This peak was understandably exhausting for Americans, many of whom felt that progressivism had done well enough to create a strong, healthy, and moral country, and now sought a return to normalcy through the conservative and laissez-faire administrations of Harding and Coolidge, which brought about nearly a decade of prosperity, wealth, and pride. Quite soon, however, the public became idealistic again, and support for progressivism resurged, albeit now with a newfound respect for the role of big business as not merely a predatory force, but a fruitful and essential part of the nation which simply demanded regular tending. Thus came Herbert Hoover, with an impressive background as a businessman, philanthropist, and veteran of the Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge administrations. Hoover was heralded by some as a new Roosevelt, a champion of a new age, a man who understood how to balance government, labor, and business without falling into the extremes of his radical progressive and conservative predecessors. But unfortunately for Hoover, he would not have the opportunity to create a new progressivism, for in 1929 the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began. The prosperity of the Harding and Coolidge administration sent the stock market soaring and naturally more people chose to invest, but continuous warnings by economists of the stock market's volatility and of eventual drops led to the sense that at any moment the public should be prepared to divest, even despite warnings against that as well. The genesis point of the Depression came from the suspension of a large fraudulent account from the London Stock Exchange, which caused stocks in New York to dip significantly. With many in the public feeling that this was the big fall-off point that they were warned about for years, mass divesting began, creating a cycle of panic which caused a continuous collapse of the stock market. Banks which had themselves invested in the stock market using their customers' savings now found themselves incapable of reimbursing their clients. Panic runs on these banks led many to turn people away and eventually closed down as they became insolvent. Hoover's original agenda had to be halted, and the resources intended for Hoover's ambitious policy plans had to be redirected to remedying the Depression. Though he had increased the role of government in the economy to an unprecedented level in an effort to alleviate the crisis, his continuous attempts to balance business and government during this time of emergency when both were in panic and beginning to impede each other's interests led to poor results. By the time the 1932 election had rolled around, the public had made Hoover and the Republican Party the scapegoat for all the woes of the Depression, and the Democrats capitalized on this, promising swift and intensive government action to immediately remedy the situation, though still the campaign emphasized a business and government balance. The Democrats essentially wanted to sell the public on their own capable and reasonable version of Hoover, who could offer a better way forward. This was in part achieved by characterizing Hoover as a Harding-style conservative rather than a true progressive. Truly, the progressivism of men like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson was no longer sufficient for the demands of the day and age. Progressive government was by its very nature a living and growing thing, and the battle for it was never ending. To stop and stall for even one single moment or one single year would not merely halt progress, but regress the march of civilization. That was the philosophy of the Democrat Party's chosen candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, a distant cousin and technically nephew-in-law to the former president Theodore Roosevelt, was born in Hyde Park, New York in 1882 to the illustrious Roosevelt and Delano families. His early years were characterized by much the same features of other well-to-do young men, receiving a private education, traveling abroad, and preparing to become a person of influence early on. Unlike Theodore, whose upbringing was dominantly shaped by his diligent father, Franklin's highly attentive mother Sarah was the key figure in his upbringing and would continue to remain close with Franklin until her passing, famously living with Roosevelt for most of his life until 1941, only 4 years before FDR passed away. Sarah Delano Roosevelt was deeply caring but also protective and controlling. She didn't believe any woman was good enough for Franklin and opposed his marriage to Theodore's niece, Eleanor. She would purchase their adjoining residences so that she could keep tabs on her son, and eventually she took a very active role in raising her grandchildren. While Roosevelt's father was sometimes described as an absent albeit caring parent whose time was occupied by work and health difficulties, Franklin did find another role model in the form of Reverend Endicott Peabody, an Episcopal priest, practitioner of muscular Christianity, cousin-in-law to Theodore Roosevelt, and headmaster of the Groton boarding school. As per the school's mission of preparing young men for roles of leadership and to serve the public, Peabody instilled young Franklin with a sense of public duty and a desire to help those in need, something which FDR regards as having made an impression upon him which remained with him for the rest of his life. He would also look to the past for inspiration, finding a particular fondness for Thomas Jefferson, by that point in time a figure largely regarded as a Southern icon, though one which Roosevelt felt a particular kinship with,
seeing him not as the agrarian farmer he attempted to portray himself as, but the aristocratic, scholarly intellectual he truly was, an elite who actually cared for the people, and the originator of what would eventually become the Democratic Party. Harkening back to the early influence of Jeffersonianism on the non-agrarian North, Roosevelt disregarded the Southern agrarianist vision of Jefferson as a tangent to the true core of his ideology, that being a belief in egalitarianism and freedom, that men were capable of their own governance in a truly democratic sense. Roosevelt would go on to Harvard and study law, all the while his cousin Theodore took up the presidency, himself becoming a new role model for Franklin, who grew infatuated with the ideas of progressivism. Despite his legal career, FDR remained drawn to politics and the opportunity to do good for the public. In 1910, the young Democrat would make his political debut, winning an election to the New York State Senate in a district that was dominantly Republican. His time as a state senator was marked by opposition to the corrupt political machine of Tammany Hall in Manhattan, attempting to block one of their political appointees and successfully negotiating a compromise. This, along with his support for agricultural and labor reform bills, would eventually earn him a reputation as a reformer, much like his cousin, who felt as though he was following in his footsteps. However, when the 1912 election rolled around, Franklin threw his support behind his fellow progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson instead of Theodore Roosevelt, who had previously been a Republican but was now running on a third-party ticket. Franklin's support was rewarded by Wilson with an appointment to the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the assistant title being in name only, as the actual Secretary of the Navy at the time was given to neglecting his duties, leaving the young upstart politician with a position of great influence. Not only did this position bring Roosevelt into the national political spotlight, but it also gave him first-hand experience in the fields of military organization, logistics, and labor negotiation, regularly communicating with the Navy's civilian employees and their unions to achieve resolutions. Roosevelt would remain within the Wilson administration into its second term, and would press Wilson to begin preparing for an early entry into the Great War, but was rebuffed by the president, who wished to remain neutral at that time. This would change with the sinking of the Lusitania, which would kick Roosevelt's position into high gear as a naval buildup began and kept his attention for the duration of the conflict. When the war ended and Wilson's presidency was approaching its terminus, Roosevelt began seeking the next step in his political career. Theodore had served in New York's legislature and served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy as well. After that, he took the New York governorship and served as McKinley's running mate before becoming president. The governorship intimidated Franklin, who felt that he wouldn't be able to win without first mending ties with Tammany Hall, having attempted to earn a nomination for senator but being utterly wiped out by the Tammany appointee. Continuing to follow the path Theodore had laid out, he sought a bid at the vice presidency and hoped his running mate would be none other than fellow member of the Wilson administration, Herbert Hoover. Hoover was ideologically progressive and shared much in common with Roosevelt, but hadn't fully aligned himself with either party until after the war, at which point he ultimately declared himself a Republican, dashing Roosevelt's hopes for the moment, though not for long, as he was still able to run alongside the Democrat Party's nominee. But once again, with Americans exhausted by 2 decades of progressivism, Roosevelt and his running mate would ultimately lose the election to Harding and Coolidge. This was a bump in the road for Roosevelt, but he decided that he'd be able to pick himself back up come the following election cycle. But then, just months later, disaster would strike. While on vacation with family, Roosevelt experienced a disease which left him paralyzed from the waist down. The disease claimed to have caused this paralysis was polio, however it has been more recently suggested that the cause may have been a neurological disorder possibly brought on by his earlier exposure to the Spanish flu or by a bacterial infection. Whatever the case, Roosevelt was devastated by his circumstances, and his mother thought it would be best for him to retire to Hyde Park and put politics behind him, but Franklin and his wife both refused. Roosevelt was determined to resume his political career as soon as possible, and for the next few years would attempt to cure his paralysis, or at the very least find ways of adapting to it. All the while he kept a close ear to politics and built relationships with various other progressive politicians, including the governor of New York, Al Smith, who would eventually ask Roosevelt to be his successor in the 1928 election so that he himself could run for president. Franklin very begrudgingly agreed, still feeling unsure if he was ready to re-enter public life. But while Smith lost the presidency, Roosevelt just narrowly won the governorship, positioning him to take charge of the state just as the Great Depression broke out. As governor, the 3 planks of FDR's administration were government aid, public works, and rooting out corruption, dismissing a number of Smith's appointees from the onset given Smith's closer alignment with Tammany Hall. This, along with Roosevelt's refusal to take advice from Smith or Tammany Hall, soured the relationship between them and began what would become a decade-long rivalry between the 2 men. Authorization would be given for the development of hydroelectric plants along the St. Lawrence River via the Power Authority Act, however very little would actually be done with this until well after FDR's governorship and presidency on account of navigational disputes. Tammany Hall remained a domineering force in New York, and Roosevelt knew that so long as it stood, he would be forced to play by their rules if he wanted to win future elections. Recognizing the need to remove the source of corruption from its position of prominence, and given just cause by a string of criminal activities which tied law enforcement and the judiciary to organized crime, FDR established the Hofstadter Committee to investigate corruption within New York City's legal system. The mess of malfeasance that Roosevelt uncovered on top of clear efforts to obstruct the investigation through the murder and disappearance of witnesses was enough to demand the removal, replacement, or imprisonment of several officers, judges, attorneys, and officials, including the mayor of New York, Jimmy Walker. The effective defanging of the corrupt legal apparatus, replacement of Tammany Hall officials with anti-corruption progressives, and the blow this dealt to the machine's reputation would spell a period of decline for it, giving Roosevelt the much-needed free rein he desired. Above all else, FDR used his time as governor to tackle the Depression in his home state. This took the form of creating additional public works projects for the sake of opening up several new jobs via the newly established Temporary Emergency Relief Administration. Additionally, efforts were made to reform the banking system in the state to prevent future bank runs, and legislation was put forward for unemployment compensation despite Roosevelt's initial hesitation that such compensation might be patronizing. The success of Roosevelt's programs and the prestige of his office soon made him a front-runner for the Democratic presidential nomination for the election of 1932. Of course, Hoover was soundly defeated, and many felt optimistic for the years ahead, some even suggesting that Roosevelt assume emergency powers and act independent of Congress for the sake of bringing a quicker end to the Depression. As president, FDR was tasked with bringing the success he saw in New York to the nation as a whole, but truthfully, there wasn't much more of a plan than that. The policies he developed for New York were broad and treated the symptoms of the Depression so that the public might ride it out more easily, but there wasn't a clear solution for ending the Depression, nor a strategy for treating the more specific issues faced by multiple parts of the country as a consequence of the Depression. Still, however, FDR remained determined to experiment with as many sensible strategies as possible to solve the various troubles then facing the country. Meeting with his would-be running mate of so many years ago during the presidential transition, FDR rebuffed Hoover's offer to develop a joint approach to solving the Depression, asserting that Hoover had every opportunity to implement such policies and had not produced any results. Even on policies which they agreed upon, Franklin refused to voice his support for them, feeling that it would give Hoover and the Republicans unneeded leverage which may infringe upon his ability to implement the New Deal. Taking office, Roosevelt immediately implemented one of these shared policies by calling for a bank holiday to alleviate the strain placed upon the banking system and allow the government to inspect bank solvency across the country, reopening those that could stand the burden, while those beyond their means were either closed or provided government assistance. Protectionist policies of the Republican and Progressive eras were also dialed back to allow for increased access to foreign markets in this time of need, giving Americans the option of cheaper foreign products and allowing for the sale of surplus American products to those markets where demand may be higher. Just as in New York, Roosevelt placed a large emphasis upon public works projects to both reduce unemployment and provide needed infrastructure for the country. He took on the issue of farm relief by providing compensation for farmers who were facing an extreme surplus which devalued their products via the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, another plan adopted from Hoover. Perhaps the largest contribution of Hoover's philosophy to the New Deal was an attempt to create a partnership between government, labor, and business through the National Recovery Administration, which did succeed in securing fairer working conditions for laborers, dramatically reduce business competition, and establish stable prices for consumers. It would, however, be struck down only 2 years later upon being deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Opposing the use of military hard power by Theodore and Wilson upon the country's southern neighbors, FDR aimed to shift to a diplomatic and economic soft power, doing so far more effectively than Taft had in an approach he now called good neighbor policy. Prohibition would of course also be overturned, and Roosevelt would initiate the construction of a memorial to Thomas Jefferson in Washington, D.C., right within the direct line of sight of the White House. Throughout all of this, Roosevelt and the New Deal would develop a good deal of enemies, those who feared the president was overstepping his power, those who felt the New Deal was worsening conditions in America by hampering the economy's ability to self-correct, and of course those who held a personal grudge against Roosevelt, such as Al Smith, Herbert Hoover, and other more moderate progressives. The effect of this drove FDR and his New Deal coalition to label their opposition as pro-business and conservative, while Roosevelt grew increasingly pro-labor, foregoing the platform of maintaining a balance with business that he had campaigned on. The New Deal coalition effectively monopolized the progressive title, despite many anti-New Dealers having been considered progressive themselves just a decade or two prior. This in many ways mirrors the transformation that Jefferson's Democratic Republicans underwent, which led them to become Jackson's Democrat Party. And in this sense, Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt were to progressivism what Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson were to Democratic Republicanism. one an originator and the other an amplifier who brought the ideology to its next evolutionary phase. Factions like the American Liberty League and the later and more effective Conservative Coalition would emerge to challenge FDR's New Deal, and as Roosevelt pushed economically to the left, the Conservatives pushed to the economic right, coming to define themselves as a movement whose purpose was to encourage and protect individual and group enterprise, private property, and personal liberty. These were the beginnings of an aggressively anti-economic interventionist and staunchly capitalist doctrine that would gradually become a more central tenet for Republicans. Republicans of the day were generally divided between conservative, liberal, and progressive factions. Conservatives generally concentrated in the Midwest, liberals in the Northeast, and progressive Republicans in the far West. The conservatives were characterized by strong anti-foreign interventionist positions, social conservatism, and a general opposition to New Deal economics. The liberals were willing to compromise on New Deal economics and ideally sought a balance between business and labor, paired with a position of foreign interventionism and free trade with liberal social values. And of course, the progressives were largely supportive of New Deal economics with moderate social views and an inclination toward foreign interventionism, though not free trade. The Democrats themselves were divided between two factions, and the growing schism between the party's conservative and progressive halves forced Roosevelt to strengthen his support base among a select few demographics. As we already said, FDR doubled down on his support for unions following growing opposition from business, earning him increased support from major urban centers and from many of the ethnic and religious minorities who occupied those cities and those labor jobs. Irish, Italian, and Polish Catholics became hardliners for Roosevelt, along with Eastern European Jews and urban blacks who had settled north during the Great Migration. Many old-stock white Southerners continued to support Roosevelt on the basis of continued loyalty to the Democrat Party, and given the greater focus Roosevelt placed upon Southern agriculture after the Dust Bowl had effectively wiped out the productiveness of the plains. But dissatisfaction still remained among some who questioned Roosevelt's appeal to minorities, those who questioned the effectiveness of his farm programs, which some saw as wasteful or inefficient, and of course there were those who questioned the ideological schism between conservatives and progressives, many Southerners finding themselves torn between opposing Northern business dominating the country, and opposing what they perceived as FDR's desire to pander to civil rights groups. Not to mention the South's recognition that despite the tremendous poverty they faced when compared to the rest of the country, they received relatively few public works programs, though no doubt this was on account of the fact that employment in the South had not fallen as dramatically as it had in industrialized areas, and employment was one of the chief purposes of those projects. Whatever the case, a gradually increasing number of conservative Southern Democrats began breaking with the Progressive New Deal coalition to align with what became the Conservative Coalition. Upon winning re-election, Roosevelt initiated the Second New Deal, which exemplified his adoption of more progressive ideals. Taxes were raised on the wealthy, Social Security was established, and greater strength was given to labor unions. But as the divide between progressives and conservatives grew wider and the Conservative Coalition emerged to oppose Roosevelt, cities became the new focus of Roosevelt's coalition, and they would become home to a newly established political machine, led by the New Deal Coalition and facilitated through government job placement organizations such as the Civil Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration. With this in place, Roosevelt had seemingly established the necessary infrastructure for his New Deal coalition to keep the reins of power for years to come. However, his presidency and reputation still hit a bump in the road following his 1937 attempt to pack the Supreme Court, who challenged his policies as unconstitutional, as well as a significant recession that very same year, which left the public questioning the efficacy of the New Deal. This, paired with consolidation of the conservative coalition across both parties, cost New Dealers control of Congress and stalled new economic policies. The economy would slowly recover over the course of the next few years, but it wouldn't be until the outbreak of World War II that the national economy finally roared back to life, and the true ideological point of contention of this era revealed itself. For while the tension between business and government had been a chief staple of the era, this was merely a carryover of the Republican and Progressive eras, which demonstrated a continuous decrease in the power of business to an increasingly powerful regulatory government. Where this era truly deviates from the Progressive era is in its pursuit and success of turning America into an active interventionist power on the global stage, something which Theodore Roosevelt pursued and failed to fully realize, something which Wilson was forced to undertake but quickly retreated from, and which the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administrations attempted to rein in to return to a more fully domestic focus. Throughout his presidency, FDR felt overcome by the desire to intervene abroad. The annexation of Ethiopia, the invasion of Manchuria, the annexation of Austria, and the Spanish Civil War all left Roosevelt wishing he could assist in some way against what he saw as aggressive, anti-democratic actions. But his hands were tied by the Neutrality Acts, which aimed to keep the United States from being pulled into another foreign war as it had during the Great War. The outbreak of World War II in Europe would become Roosevelt's deciding factor in pursuing an unprecedented third term. And with Congress's support having been lost, Roosevelt believed that rallying the public around a joint cause such as this may prove his only hope of fulfilling the New Deal agenda. Roosevelt's allies began to fall away, both because of this serious break with tradition and account of his increasing ideological radicalism. The Republicans had adopted a strategy of challenging Roosevelt with candidates who could offer a similar but slightly more moderate platform to his own, drawing largely from their liberal wing. Roosevelt's opponent this cycle would be Wendell Willkie, who, like Roosevelt, ran with New York as his home state. Of course, he ran on a more moderate version of Roosevelt's platform, supporting the New Deal and even expressing his intention to provide resource support to the Allies abroad, but refusing to allow an American entry into the war. Roosevelt, attempting to dispel this concern, had promised to keep America out of the European war. While this would prove to be Roosevelt's closest election yet, he still won by a wide margin and became the first president to serve a third term. Gradually, Roosevelt whittled away at the red tape of neutrality, and gradually the United States began churning out more and more resources for the Allies, becoming what Roosevelt called an arsenal of democracy. As the war in Europe ramped up, preparedness efforts began in the United States, Franklin taking it upon himself to do what Wilson refused to do in the First Great War. He built up an ideological basis for America to involve itself, to secure freedom and democracy as not merely American ideals, but fundamental human rights, something he sought to convey in his For Freedom speech, in which he punctuated each freedom with everywhere in the world. The policy of cash and carry, which originally only provided essential supplies and resources for direct payment, was replaced by the policy of Lend-Lease, which expanded sales to include military equipment and supplies, now at no expense so long as it officially served the purpose of protecting the United States. Clashes began within the conservative coalition as the northern conservatives of the Midwest generally favored a position of non-interventionism, while the historically offensive southern conservatives took a war-hawkish position, gradually pressuring the northerners into the interventionist camp with the support of some interventionist progressives. Weaponry, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and more were now exported from the United States to Britain, China, and the Soviet Union, bringing the United States into the war in every way but direct combat, virtually guaranteeing that Axis retaliation would follow, and giving the United States just cause to officially enter the war on the grounds of self-defense. Knowing well that this inevitability was approaching, Roosevelt and the Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, negotiated agreements for a post-war world order if the United States were to join the conflict. This Atlantic Charter outlined a plan for Anglo-American global leadership. To this end, neither Britain nor the United States would seek any post-war territory, border adjustments would be based on the will of those inhabiting said lands, free trade would be enacted globally, disarmament would be pursued, and self-determination of peoples would be enforced. This last point in Churchill's mind only applying to those lands under Axis domination, but in the mind of Roosevelt and many others in the New Deal coalition, this meant decolonization and the end of the trade monopolies held by empires like Britain. Naturally, the US was no longer doing business with any of the Axis powers, including Japan, who had been intensely dependent upon the United States for a number of resources including iron, copper, and oil to keep their conquest of East Asia going. Negotiations were held but ultimately failed to reach a compromise. Without other options, the Japanese simply decided to continue their military expansion further south into the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. But anticipating an American response to their continued expansion in pursuit of an alternative oil source, the Japanese determined that their best hope of preventing American interference in their plans was a preemptive strike on the US's strongest launching off point in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was launched, but American aircraft carriers, perhaps the most valuable asset in the US Navy, were fortunately out on missions. Additionally, while several ships were damaged or destroyed and over 2,000 personnel were lost, the Japanese failed to cripple the American Navy as intended, and so, given just cause, the US retaliated against Japan with nearly its full naval force. Germany declared war upon the United States shortly then after. Roosevelt had gotten his wish. America was now at war, and America would win. However, by the 1944 election, the war had not yet come to an end, and Roosevelt was in worsening health. Despite this, he was determined to continue on to provide the country consistent leadership during the conflict. He ran for what would become his fourth term and again see diminishing support when facing yet another liberal Northeastern Republican, Thomas E. Dewey of New York. Still, Roosevelt managed to muster a safe victory, but he would pass away only 82 days into his term, and 1 month before the end of the war in Europe, being succeeded by his vice president, Harry Truman. Truman, a humble former senator from Missouri, brought with him a strong work ethic and a determination to prove himself as a leader, following portrayals of him as little more than a political lackey and a clueless farm boy early on in his career. With the war in Europe effectively over by that point, American attention turned to Japan, who had yet to surrender. Preparations were underway for a full-scale, grueling invasion of the Japanese islands, but another, more expedient option was also on the table. Since 1941, there had been a covert project authorized by Roosevelt to support the development of atomic weapons. The Manhattan Project, as it would come to be known, would bear fruit in July of 1945 with the success of the first atomic bomb test. Less than 1 month later, an atomic bomb would be dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima and another on Nagasaki just some days later. Japan, faced with the prospect of further American bombings and with the Soviet Union having directed their own attention toward the Japanese, finally surrendered just days after the destruction of Nagasaki. An official peace treaty was signed less than 1 month later, and the war was officially over. More than that, the war economy had successfully lifted the United States out of the Depression, but Truman's work had only just begun. With the crises that kept Roosevelt in power resolved, and the charisma of FDR as a familiar leader now gone, Truman was hemorrhaging support, seeing losses in the midterm elections and leaving him unsure of how to proceed. Truman was woefully underprepared to handle the Reconstruction in Europe, was left to manage Roosevelt's plan for an international mediating body of nations, and was forced to deal with the Soviets in an emerging rivalry for influence on the fractured post-war world. To aid him in meeting these demands, he deferred to men better equipped to tackle foreign policy such as Dean Acheson and George Marshall. Additionally, Truman saw to the reorganization of the Office of Strategic Services established by Roosevelt during the war into the National Intelligence Authority and the Central Intelligence Group to provide him insight on foreign affairs. These organizations would eventually give way to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency nearly 2 years later, and play an increasingly active role in Cold War politics. Looking more domestically, Truman sought to transform the New Deal, which he saw as being developed for a struggling economy, into a system tailored to a thriving economy. Truman's Fair Deal, as he called it, expanded key quality-of-life policies from the New Deal and continued to facilitate infrastructure development and national works, but now came with a firm stance on civil rights unprecedented in Progressive-era governance. Truman sought to bring about racial integration in the military by executive order, established a committee to investigate civil rights in the country, and gave an impassioned speech to Congress on the need to take further action for racial justice in the country. Conservative Southern Democrats, having long been a pillar of the New Deal coalition, would not abide by the federal government attempting to enforce desegregation upon them, and swiftly many Southerners broke rank with the Democrat Party, forming what would become known as the Dixiecrats, who gradually schismed away the Southern Democrat vote. This was reflected in the 1948 election, with 4 deep Southern states throwing their support behind Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond. Despite this splitting of the Democrat vote, however, Truman narrowly emerged with a victory over liberal Republican Thomas E. Dewey. The effects of the Cold War were beginning to be felt at home as mass speculation of Soviet espionage ran rampant. In response to this, Truman passed an executive order that would allow for the FBI to investigate federal employees to determine if they posed a risk to national security. In reality, this was largely for show, as Truman was facing accusations of being soft on communism, and truthfully, Truman didn't take the threat of Soviet espionage seriously, despite evidence of its existence at the time which would have been available to him. Truman's second term would truly be dominated by Cold War affairs. The Marshall Plan would begin seeing widespread implementation across Europe, giving these countries the resources necessary to rebuild. Truman would recognize Israel despite Marshall warning him against doing so, and NATO would be established to secure the countries of the Western Bloc from Soviet aggression, this alliance soon expanding to include Greece and Turkey as well. However, this period would also see the outbreak of the Korean War, a situation made all the worse by a geopolitical blunder of Truman's first term, in which an inability to establish a coalition government in China and a lack of action ultimately allowed the communists to seize control of China. The Korean War would prove to be a tiring conflict which ended nearly where it began at the cost of millions of lives, and foreshadowed the future nature of proxy conflicts the United States would find itself embroiled in. Though increasingly the United States opted to act surgically, utilizing the CIA to instigate coups, assassinate opponents, and destabilize regions. The ratification of the 22nd Amendment in 1951 established in law a 2-term limit, but happened to exclude Truman given his incumbent status. However, facing increasingly diminishing popularity, Truman opted not to run for a 3rd term, leaving the Democrats truly without a charismatic candidate, nor someone who could offer the public something new. Taft and the conservative Republicans believed this would finally be their year. However, once again the Liberals stepped in, and rather than put forward Dewey as their candidate of choice, they ran popular war general Dwight Eisenhower instead, who narrowly beat out Taft for the nomination. Eisenhower assured his peers and the public that he wasn't a run-of-the-mill liberal Republican, referring to himself as a modern Republican or a progressive conservative, but in reality, he wasn't at all like the conservative faction of his party. Eisenhower staunchly supported the New Deal, even expanding it in some regards, and took a similar if not harder stance on civil rights as Truman did, utilizing federal troops to enforce integration and asserting that it was a matter of national security, as communists could propagandize segregation and tarnish the image of American-style democracy and freedom to other countries. In foreign policy, Eisenhower continued to expand America's presence abroad, instigating a CIA-backed coup in Iran, intervening in the Suez Crisis to assert to Britain, France, and Israel that they must abide by the American global strategy, furthered efforts at decolonization, and dedicated American men, resources, and air support to France and its conflict with Vietnamese rebels almost immediately after the war in Korea had been resolved. Ironically, when a revolution broke out in neighboring Cuba, Eisenhower's approach had merely been to sell weapons to the Batista government, sales which were eventually stopped. This great deal of inaction on the part of the Eisenhower administration allowed for the emergence of communism within Cuba, at which point Eisenhower finally authorized the CIA to begin planning an operation for the removal of Fidel Castro. In yet another geopolitical blunder, Eisenhower promoted his concept of the Eisenhower Doctrine, which asserted America's promise to protect Arab countries from the threat of, quote, international communism, which Arab leaders understood as, and which Eisenhower would admit to actually meaning, the US intended to suppress the economically left-leaning Arab nationalist movement which had grown in popularity at the time. Despite his alignment with the Republican Party, Eisenhower would prove to be a strong continuation of Truman-era policies and of the larger New Deal, Fair Deal era, receiving a great deal of criticism from the conservative branch of his party, including from then-junior Senator Barry Goldwater. Opposition within both parties to the New Dealers was effectively sidelined and denied effective representation. While Republican conservatives were left without a party with which to represent them, the conservative Democrats took it upon themselves to do what Southern Baptists do best: secede. From the Democrat Party, that is. 1960 would bring Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon up against Democratic newcomer John F. Kennedy. The election would be incredibly close, the popular vote coming within less than half a percentage point, and some states having gone one way or the other by a single percentage point or less. Accusations were of course made of tampering and fraud, but in the end Kennedy won the election, becoming the first Catholic president in American history, as well as the then youngest man elected to the office. These standout attributes, along with Kennedy's charisma, are in great part what he would be remembered for. Kennedy was at times seen as more of a celebrity than a leader, and early on it's understandable why that was. His approach to economic or government policy wasn't anywhere near as heavy-handed as his predecessors, not expanding New Deal fiscal or antitrust policies, but actually fostering a rapprochement with business to ultimately grow the economy in a Keynesian fashion, demonstrating an economically liberal mindset and foreshadowing the rising popularity of such policies among younger politicians of the era. Of course, Kennedy would, at the recommendation of his vice president Lyndon Baines Johnson, also oversee the expansion of the nascent American space program begun under Eisenhower. The Apollo program was already underway, and under Kennedy, given the intent of placing a man on the moon within the decade, Kennedy was personally skeptical of the program, and it would truly become Johnson's pet project during the administration. Perhaps Kennedy's greatest focus on the home front, like Truman and Eisenhower, was civil rights. Being an Irish Catholic himself, Kennedy felt firsthand the effects of prejudice and discrimination, but considered himself fortunate enough to belong to a family of high standing, and imagined how much worse it must be for the more recent Italian immigrants, who by this point would have been largely moving up as a group from filling the labor class to becoming a part of the middle class, and of course there were difficulties associated with achieving that. The rise of the Italian population in America, as well as other third wavers, also facilitated the emergence of a greater element of organized criminal activity in the country, whose actions began to bleed into politics, most especially in big cities, and in regard to political machines. Even more so, Kennedy's heart went out to African Americans who he felt were especially discriminated against and bogged down by the law. Kennedy's sentiments were largely shared by other Italians, Irish, Poles, and Jews who could sympathize with this experience of discrimination, and thus this group, who largely owed their origins to the third immigration wave of the late 1800s and early 1900s, would become highly activist in calling for equality in the country and shedding what they recognized as the yoke of Protestant Anglo-American dominance. In foreign policies where Kennedy truly defined himself as a leader to America as a whole, Kennedy would butt heads with new Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, most famously following the Bay of Pigs invasion intent on removing Castro from power, and in the subsequent Cuban Missile Crisis, when following the discovery of Soviet missile sites being constructed on the Caribbean island, many feared that the US and Russia would finally resort to nuclear war. Kennedy tactfully diffused the crisis and demonstrated to the country that despite his youth and the prejudice associated with his background, he was capable of steering the country effectively through the Cold War. Kennedy would expand on good neighbor doctrine to build closer relationships with the country's North and South American neighbors. Simultaneously, however, the CIA began acting more independently in its crackdown on foreign groups and individuals deemed threatening to American interests, particularly within these countries but also within the Middle East, where the US began taking a more active role. Kennedy strengthening America's alliance with Israel as it became clear that the Arab bloc was shifting toward the Soviet camp. Kennedy himself likely also holding some more personal sympathies for the Israelis given his own experience with American Jews as his political allies. In Vietnam, Kennedy escalated the American involvement begun under Eisenhower, increasing American presence nearly 20-fold to 16,000 personnel, despite his hesitations that it might draw the United States into another Korea-esque situation. Kennedy's presidency would be cut short in 1963 when he was assassinated by crazed communist sympathizer Lee Harvey Oswald. Given the circumstances of changing American politics, the increased autonomy of the CIA, the unscrupulous character of his power-hungry vice president, the secrecy of the Cold War, the rising influence of organized crime, and a number of seeming inconsistencies related to the incident, Kennedy's assassination has been the subject of much speculation, with many believing that Oswald did not act alone, and even more so that Oswald was a patsy, and the assassination was fully orchestrated by the CIA, though to what end is unclear. Continued secrecy would only contribute to the propagation of theories. However, in December of 2020, 97% of documents related to the assassination, some 13,000 altogether, were announced to be released unredacted. Whatever the case, Kennedy was dead and would be succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson, a more senior man than Kennedy, had been a longtime admirer of FDR and his New Deal policies, much more so than the younger and more idealistic Kennedy. That being said, he was infamously described as power-hungry, unprincipled, and conniving, attributes which seem to have served him well in the cutthroat world of American politics. Even as vice president, Johnson sought to increase the authority of his office, something which, along with Johnson's personality, brought much disdain for him from Kennedy and his inner circle. Johnson established a committee to investigate the Kennedy assassination and got to work on presidential matters soon after. Johnson continued the fair dealer crusade for quality of life economic policy, taking the form of a so-called war on poverty, which aimed not to alleviate but cure poverty through the creation of new jobs, expanding access to affordable education, and providing government aid to those struggling to afford essential goods by creating the food stamp program. Of course, Johnson would also attempt to bring a successful close to the crusade for civil rights with the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which officially outlawed discrimination, bringing an official end to institutionally enforced segregation. Having only about a year in office from what remained of Kennedy's term, Johnson sought re-election and was brought to compete against Republican Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was an unorthodox Republican, however. He was very much a business conservative and opposed to many aspects of the New Deal, but was arguably a social liberal much like the Northeastern Republicans. He himself was ethnically Jewish and a strong supporter of civil rights, which might have been enough to just regard him as a liberal, but he was also markedly opposed to big government and federal authority, much in the Southern conservative tradition, which made him oppose the use of federal authority to enforce desegregation at the state level. Goldwater's stance on the relationship between the federal government and civil rights was enough to secure him the support of the conservative Deep South, which for the first time in its entire history flipped entirely for a single Republican candidate. However, despite his general alignment with the liberal Republicans, this faction considered his opposition to federally enforced desegregation as much too conservative. Midwestern conservatives questioned his opposition to the use of government power for conservative policies, while progressive New Dealers found themselves without much common ground at all. And so Johnson would utterly defeat Goldwater and secure a full presidential term. But this election would foreshadow coming changes to national politics that would emerge in the subsequent decades. Johnson would eventually escalate American involvement in Vietnam to the point of active combat following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an event which we now know was deliberately warped by American intelligence organizations to provoke national leadership into escalating American intervention. The US would continue combat operations in Vietnam until 1973, the consequences of this conflict having a profoundly negative impact upon American morale and faith in government, which would continue well into the future. The years of civil rights activism and resistance to it had not been calmed by Johnson's legislating, but were in fact inflamed by it. Disagreements about the extent of civil rights, feeling that civil rights had not gone far enough, and of course sentiments that it had gone too far led to a long series of bloody race riots across several American cities for multiple years. Johnson established the Kerner Commission to investigate the causes of the riots and potential solutions, only to be told the cause was racism and that American whites needed to do more to ensure equality for African Americans. This conclusion was reached despite the fact that those cities which did face violent rioting were among the most thoroughly integrated and generally regarded as liberal and supportive of racial justice, close to 90% of race riots during Johnson's administration having occurred in northern and western cities where integrationist policies were adopted early on. Johnson would, however, proceed to produce further civil rights legislation, including the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, along with making notable African American appointments to office. The previous national origins immigration policy, which aimed to maintain a proportional immigration flow based on the present makeup of the country, was done away with by Johnson's signing of the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act, which abolished national quotas and opened immigration to all nations, which would lead to an exponential increase in migration to the United States over the following decades. Additionally, Johnson increased funding for schools and educational programs in an effort to create greater access to education, most especially for the lower classes. He saw to investigating and enacting healthcare reform, leading to the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, and began a project of urban renewal, community planning, and poverty eradication known as the Model Cities Program in cities like Detroit and Atlanta. Johnson considered running for a second full term, but in 1968 his popularity had plummeted, his health appeared to be growing worse, and the New Deal coalition was collapsing along Labor, Liberal, and Conservative factions. The Republicans were faring slightly better. The country was gearing up for its next great change. It demanded capable leadership to tackle the new struggles it was facing, but that would not come immediately. There was a bumpy road ahead as the country advanced into uncharted territory and made one last great political transition.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt had created a new paradigm in the United States. Following his unprecedented 4 elections to office, his New Deal coalition continued to hold onto power and shaped a post-war country defined by an economically interventionist government, a government which increasingly emphasized the preeminence of urban centers and the political machines which FDR established within them. This would be an early inception point for the later rural-urban divide which would emerge in the country. However, initially the New Deal coalition would be able to maintain overwhelming support from rural labor centers, namely regions of the country with high potential for resource extraction such as Appalachia, the Rockies, the Colorado Plateau, and the Great Basin. New Dealers were also able to rely upon the support of the largely agricultural southeastern states, the loyally democratic though socially conservative Solid South, having remained defiant to the Republican Party which defeated them in the Civil War. Despite the order FDR had established, the country would be on course to transform demographically, with the emergence of the suburbs soon shifting a large segment of FDR's reliable pro-New Deal population out of urban centers, all the while the Second Great Migration saw a mass transplanting of the southern black population to northern and western cities to the point that by the end of the 1960s, nearly 80% of America's black population lived in urban areas nationwide. Consequently, the white flight that would follow would drive greater numbers of white city dwellers to move to the suburbs, leaving nearly half of the total national population to call the suburbs home by that point in time. Cities weren't the only part of the country that was changing either. For decades, rural America had slowly been hollowing out, something which we might attribute to the mass development and urbanization brought to the country by the first wave of Republican presidents. Of course, prior to the Republican era, the nation had been dominated by its agricultural South, and ever since then, agriculture had played an increasingly diminishing role in the lives of the average American, with innovative tools and machinery allowing farmers to produce increasing quantities of crop with a fraction of the manpower, driving many who could no longer find work in rural communities to seek better opportunities in their nearest cities, which of course shrunk the size of the average rural community, but still kept many somewhat prosperous, albeit simpler than their urban counterparts. This effect would be compounded by the crop failures of the Dust Bowl and further technological innovations throughout the decades, and while initially the mid-20th century would still see a majority of rural communities in good health, toward the end of the century the continued loss of population and business would create a cascading effect that led many rural towns to become unsustainable, eventually producing what in the modern day are known as rural ghettos, or more colloquially as the boondocks, backwoods, or the sticks. All of this paired with a transformation of national political ideology and what would become a massive rise in immigration following the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act would significantly shake up the political dynamics and electoral landscape of the country as the years wore on. The United States was now a power which played a major role in foreign politics. Standing as one of the 2 post-war superpowers, it took on the responsibilities of rebuilding Europe in the aftermath of the Second Great War and began carving out a sphere of influence for itself, whilst attempting to limit the sphere of its rival, the Soviet Union. Domestically on a high following victory in the war and experiencing an economic resurgence in the wake of the Great Depression, the country also turned its attention away from alleviating issues of need to more social issues of the day affecting particular groups. This meant increased emphasis upon civil rights, union rights, care for the poor, and generally attempting to lift up groups seen as disadvantaged. But idealism perhaps led the country to reach beyond its means, as reforms and foreign actions were met with increased criticism from the public. The last years of New Dealer Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency demonstrated a rising desire for change among the citizenry, and made clear the divisions within the New Deal coalition along liberal, conservative, and labor lines. As a result of this, anti-New Dealers within the Republican Party were able to take advantage of these circumstances to propel former President Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon into the White House on a platform that highlighted reducing New Deal-era social welfare deemed unnecessary in a post-oppression nation, promoting law and order in the wake of years of anti-war and race-based rioting, as well as taking a firmer stance against communism while toning down foreign interventionism, particularly in regard to Asia, something Nixon had opposed since his time as a senator during the Truman administration. Nixon rallied disenchanted Southern conservatives who felt that the Democratic Party had become the party of civil rights and who had, in an unprecedented fashion, turned out for Republican candidate Barry Goldwater in the previous election on account of his opposing the Civil Rights Act on grounds of constitutionality and overstepping of federal power. Nixon, however, was not opposed to civil rights or even a militant anti-communist. Nixon was a nuanced and moderate figure whose comparably common-sense approach to policy earned him favor across the political spectrum, from individuals who simply wanted a solution to the various new troubles facing the country and those old issues which the New Deal coalition had swept aside for years to focus on the faction's agenda. Nixon's appeal to what he popularly called the silent majority would win him a landslide re-election in 1972 as well, carrying all but one state, and laying the foundation for America's next great change. Though of course, while he laid the groundwork for it, he would not be the man to launch this era entirely, finding himself compelled to step down from office following a national scandal which ruined his credibility and halted the country's political transformation. Domestically, Nixon had sought to roll back what he saw as the overreaching of federal authority and high government spending instituted by the New Deal coalition. His vision for this was known as New Federalism, which, contrary to the original brand of American federalism, sought decentralization of government power to the states, most notably through his policy of revenue sharing, which distributed federal funds to the various state governments to use as they saw fit. Facing resistance to these policies from congressional New Dealers, Nixon redirected his attention to alleviating economic woes in a time of inflation brought on by New Deal policies and the expense of war in Vietnam. Despite attempts to reduce government spending, Nixon found himself unable to combat inflation and ultimately suspended the gold standard, allowing the government to control the money supply and for the moment produce a temporary solution to the high government spending. But in the long term, this created an unprecedented level of inflation which would continue well into the 21st century, along with a rising level of national debt as the combination of Keynesian-style spending, globalization of the economy, and dropping of the gold standard all but abandoned any sense of a baseline for the economy, setting the stage for a new economic age of American history. Despite Southern conservative impressions that Nixon's talk of law and order and states' rights were merely euphemisms for opposing civil rights policies, a trend of belief that would continue among Southern and rural conservative voters, Nixon would continue to pursue integration policies moderately, not enforcing them aggressively but carrying them through when and where it was constitutional. One of Nixon's most noteworthy of such policies was the Philadelphia Plan, a system that required government contractors in Philadelphia to meet certain racial hiring quotas, and which was later expanded to other cities. This was part of a larger vision of Nixon's that he called black capitalism, a means of enabling the African American population to acquire valuable work and business skills to succeed in the American economy. This too would carry on throughout the era, with black employment or black economic conditions becoming a staple talking point for both parties. Nixon's administration would also see to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in response to a growing desire for environmental conservation, a matter which would become increasingly prevalent among later administrations, especially upon the end of the Cold War. Nixon would oversee the success of the moon landing in 1969, but canned follow-up plans for a moon base and Mars mission to further cut back on government spending. Nixon would also launch what became known as the War on Drugs, tackling this new moral dilemma which appeared to be rising with both the free drug use of the counterculture movement and with veterans returning from overseas addicted to drugs, typically narcotics and marijuana, which were used by the soldiers during the war to alleviate pain and stress. Drug use would fluctuate but generally continue to rise over the next several years, with greater quantities and varieties of drugs arriving in the US from Latin America as immigration from these countries rose and as pharmaceutical companies normalized the use of opioids in later decades as painkillers without consideration for their addictive properties. The war on drugs would become a defining staple of this era and a recurring issue tackled by nearly every administration that followed, with some drugs such as marijuana and certain hallucinogenics becoming tolerated, whilst opioids and methamphetamine remain widespread on account of their addictiveness despite the stigma and hazards surrounding them. In foreign policy, Nixon was aided by a man who would become one of the most influential political advisors of this era, a chief architect of the then-emerging neoconservative geopolitical strategy, Henry Kissinger. Together, Nixon and Kissinger worked together to reach peace in Vietnam, court communist China as a means of isolating the Soviet Union without the use of force, prop up Israel as a powerful ally in the pro-Soviet Middle East, and quietly prevent the rise of pro-communist governments within North and South America through the tactical use of the Central Intelligence Agency. The name of Kissinger's game was détente, to diffuse tensions strategically before they led to larger, more costly conflicts, and for the most part, this policy had proven highly effective, becoming a consistent staple of the administrations of this era until the end of the Cold War. Nixon's ultimate goal was to avoid direct war for the United States, provide financial support to allies, and promote peace whenever possible, including attempting to normalize relations between the US and USSR. While his overall success in guiding the country toward long-term security is questionable, he had undoubtedly opened the door to a new future, but once again he would not be able to follow through on his final goals. Nixon had a very mixed relationship with the increasingly prevalent intelligence sector of the government. He believed that left-wing operatives within the CIA in particular were conspiring against his administration and the country by leaking information to news sources, rival politicians, and potentially foreign actors. In response to this, Nixon created what became known as the White House Plumbers to stop these leaks until he could restructure the CIA and transfer management of its covert operations to a new agency under the Director of National Intelligence. It would be these plumbers who, without Nixon's authorization, broke into the Watergate building and initiated the scandal that would ultimately force Nixon to resign after he attempted to hide his administration's connection to the plumbers. What followed were probes into the intelligence agency's actions over several years, uncovering an assortment of off-color operations, some of which were leaked to the public at the time, others of which remained confidential until several years later. With Nixon out of office and his vice president having already stepped down previously due to another scandal, power fell to Gerald Ford, the first man to assume the office of the presidency without being elected either president or vice president, having served as House Minority Leader prior to his appointment to the vice presidency. Ford ran a lukewarm administration that largely sought to restore the reputation of the Republican Party. However, the damage had been done, and in the subsequent midterm election, the Democrats had utterly defeated the Republicans, strengthening their hold over both houses of Congress and preventing Ford from vetoing several congressional decisions. Of the policies which Ford was able to pass through against the resistance of Congress, most led to lackluster results. Henry Kissinger during this time would continue as a close advisor, working with Ford to continue pursuing a normalization of relations with China and the USSR, and to maintain a powerful Western bloc secure from rival forces. However, it was becoming increasingly clear to many that the Near East was becoming a major theater of interest for the country, between tensions arising among Greece and Turkey which threatened the security of NATO, to rising hostilities between the Arabs and Israelis, which prompted Ford to consider withdrawing support from Israel, only to be refused by some 76 of Congress's 100 senators. The Ford presidency achieved little outside of continuing détente policies and perhaps most remarkably expanding the Federal Election Campaign Act passed under Nixon to regulate campaign spending. Ford would ultimately be defeated in his bid for a second term by Southern liberal Democrat Jimmy Carter, whose distinctive views led him to clash with both Northern liberals and Southern conservatives, all the while his highly lukewarm approach to policy and inability to maneuver DC politics left many to view him as ineffective, idealistic, and weak. Since Nixon's resignation, crisis of confidence had been the phrase haunting the presidency, and Carter would not help to dispel it. Carter in great part owed his rise to power to his status as a Washington outsider, his moderate reputation, and his favorable media coverage, the latter of which propelled him from a relatively obscure figure to the choice Democrat candidate, and eventually the president-elect. However, his administration would be rocked by an energy crisis, economic stagflation, and international troubles. The costs of the Vietnam War, the 1973 energy crisis, and the abolition of the gold standard among other issues had left the country in a recession that lasted from the late Nixon administration to the mid-Ford administration, and the lingering effects of which carried on into Carter's administration, with recovery being repeatedly halted and impeded. The energy crisis was largely brought on by conflict and instability within the Middle East, and particularly Middle Eastern animosity toward the United States, something which was only further fueled by Nixon's doctrine of foreign policy in the region, a doctrine which pledged not direct intervention but support for regional allies against their enemies. In particular, this meant the American allies of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and for a time, Iran. During Nixon's time, this saw an alliance of oil-producing Arab nations refuse to conduct business with the United States, enacting an oil embargo that spawned the oil crisis of '73. The effects of that embargo would linger, and during Carter's time, the continued destabilization of the region in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in Iran would further cut into America's oil supplies and send economic recovery into a tailspin. The Islamic Revolution would continue to impact Carter with what many argue was his greatest folly, his handling of a hostage crisis which saw 66 Americans taken captive in Iran. Carter's attempts to liberate these hostages would result in the death of 8 soldiers, ultimately forcing him to compromise with the new Iranian regime. Despite these issues, Carter would attempt to pursue his liberal agenda, one which entailed expanding the welfare system, furthering the promotion of civil rights by bringing attention to issues concerning the LGBT community and women, seeking to enact affirmative action policies, and decriminalizing cannabis, all of which produced mixed results at the time, but which would go on to become mainstays of the Democrat Party. Abroad, Carter sought to shift focus away from using American might to challenge communism, and instead turned toward using American wealth and resources to promote humanitarianism and cooperation. In line with Nixon's policy of détente, relations between the US and People's Republic of China would be strengthened at the expense of Taiwan, with the US beginning a general reduction of its military presence across East Asia, as well as in Latin America, terminating support for strong anti-communist Latin American allies which Carter viewed as being in violation of democratic and liberal values. South Africa and Rhodesia would also come under greater scrutiny for what Carter called discriminatory and anti-democratic policies, though the authoritarian native African-run regime of Zaire continued to receive support during this period. Beyond this, the Panama Canal would officially begin a process of being ceded to the Republic of Panama, and Carter would welcome over 100,000 Cuban refugees into the country during the Mariel boat lift. Carter's soft-handed approach to foreign policy and emphasis on light détente would come into heavy question with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
This, paired with a crisis in Iran, a stagnant economy, and ineffectual domestic policy, would cost him re-election. Though that being said, just as Nixon had laid the foundations for a new Republican Party, so would Carter's administration foreshadow a new solidifying faction of the Democrat Party. Finally, the chaos and uncertainty of this era was brought to an end under the leadership of a man who exemplified the vision which men like Goldwater, Nixon, and Kissinger had been building. The Cold War had transformed the United States. No longer was it a regional power sheltered behind its own borders. It was a superpower which sought global influence, a global presence, a global economy. America had received the natural successor to the foreign policy begun under men like Theodore Roosevelt and FDR, while breaking with the economically pro-labor positions traditionally associated with them, amalgamating this pro-globalist foreign policy with a domestic policy that appealed to both rural conservatives and the business interests of the North and West. This was the beginning of the Reagan administration. Having begun his public life as an actor in 1966, Reagan would seek the California governorship, beating out his opponent, incumbent Governor Pat Brown, by capitalizing on his own star power and his opponent's shortcomings as governor. Earlier in his life, Ronald Reagan had aligned himself with the New Dealer branch of the Democrat Party, idolizing FDR and demonstrating remarkably socially liberal views for his time. However, his experience in the military and as an actor working in Hollywood had soured him on the idea of large-scale bureaucracy, welfare systems, and communism, the latter of which he felt was widespread in Hollywood, and posed a legitimate threat to American security, sowing the seeds for his anti-communist, anti-economic interventionist, and anti-labor views, and thus he joined the Republican Party. As governor, Reagan would pursue policies which would continue to remain dominant issues nationwide for decades to come. He would oversee an effort to balance the budget, cut welfare policies to encourage self-sufficiency, and reduce taxes. In 1967, he would sign into effect the Therapeutic Abortion Act, decriminalizing medical abortions under certain circumstances, and would see to the passing of California's most restrictive gun control law of the day that same year via the Mulford Act, seeing it as necessary to maintaining law and order by preventing radical groups from carrying firearms in public. Reagan would also take significant action to reform the criminal justice system as well, but despite this would see robberies and homicides rise during his governorship. In addition to this, in 1969 he would pass the country's first no-fault divorce law, making divorce a far easier process to initiate by either spouse, setting a standard for several other states to follow. Reagan's political positions, actions, and goals during his governorship, in contrast to what many recognize as his more conservative presidential administration, reveal a man who was genuinely inexperienced, or at least for a time, disinterested in domestic social issues, preferring instead to focus more on economic matters and later upon foreign policy. Naturally, Reagan had demonstrated tolerance and even support in his early years for racial equality, LGBT rights, and feminism, but as his anti-communist and small government views developed, he would find himself inclined to embrace more conservative positions, at least publicly. Immediately following his time as governor, Reagan would pursue the presidential nomination, and despite early shortcomings, finally succeeded in securing the presidential office in 1980, much in the same fashion by which he won his governorship, by capitalizing upon his own celebrity and emphasizing the failures of his opponent. Though that being said, Reagan would come to power with a definitive platform that achieved wide appeal, a platform that was best simplified by the phrase small government and strong defense. Southerners flocked to Reagan's stance on states' rights and law and order, once again interpreting this as a euphemism for anti-civil rights policies despite Reagan's pro-tolerance track record. Both Northeastern liberals and Southern conservatives clung to Reagan's anti-communism and desire for increased foreign intervention and free trade. The business class adored Reagan's laissez-faire approach to regulation and economics. All the while, rural evangelicals felt represented by Reagan's identification with traditional Christian values, his image as a Christian leader being bolstered by evangelical groups like the Moral Majority. In a matter of time, Reagan was able to frame to the public America's struggle against Russia as a struggle between Christendom and godlessness, essentially politicizing moral issues in the scheme of Cold War politics, something which truly had not been capitalized upon in such a way since the Eisenhower administration, if even that. Consequently, Reagan's platform and positions across his two terms would create a final realignment of voters, driving pro-labor, social liberal, secular, and minority-focused factions more thoroughly to the Democrat Party, whilst redefining the Republican Party into the party of free trade, big business, states' rights, and Christian values. Reagan was able to appeal to rural America through his Christian and small government talking points while finding a new base of support in middle-class suburban America, who were disenchanted with the liberal and labor policies of past presidents and swayed by Reagan's economic promises and talking points on family values. And while initially much of the country still stood divided in 1980, by the subsequent 1984 election, Reagan had shored up his support base and thoroughly completed the political realignment. Slowly, government involvement in the economy faded, with nearly half of all business regulations by this point being eradicated or curtailed. Funding for various New Deal and Great Society programs were cut, free trade was expanded, and income taxes were brought down. Thus came the rise of Reaganomics. Taxes were cut for the majority of Americans, but most especially the wealthy, while family incomes rose, and though Reagan would face repeated economic difficulties during his presidency, including a tripling of the national debt, many began to feel that the country was quickly recovering from its financial woes. Under Reagan, détente took a brief backseat to strong defense, military spending increased dramatically, new military technologies were explored, and funding to anti-communist movements across the globe increased without regard for long-term implications, largely being done under the oversight of the CIA and National Endowment for Democracy, something which would later wrap Reagan up in the Iran-Contra scandal. The foundations for what would later become the Patriot Act were also established via Reagan's Executive Order 12333, which outlined standards and practices for spying on both foreign figures and American citizens believed to be connected to hostile governments, terrorist groups, and drug trafficking. The early outline for what would eventually become NAFTA would also come into being thanks to Reagan's 1984 Trade and Tariff Act and the subsequent Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement. Since the signing of the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, immigration had rapidly been on the rise in the United States, including illegal immigration. In an effort to curb the latter, Reagan would initiate a heightening of border security, criminalize the hiring of illegal immigrants, and grant amnesty to those presently within the country, some 3 million at the time. Without proper enforcement of illegal hiring laws and border security, however, Reagan's actions only had the inverse effect of encouraging more foreigners to enter the country illegally, recognizing a lack of enforcement and the possibility for additional amnesty bills in the future. This would lead to a massive influx of Central Americans to the southwestern states especially over the years, and the emergence of a significant Hispanic diaspora in the Southwest which would largely come to favor the Democrat Party. Reagan would attempt to deliver on his evangelical policies by seeking a national abortion ban, promoting policies that upheld marriage and family values, and attempting to secure voluntary prayer in schools, but fell short of achieving any of these. What he did achieve was the establishment of Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a national holiday, which was favored by black Christians. He strengthened America's relationship with Israel, which was well received by evangelicals, and he intensified the war on drugs to combat a significant spike in drug use since the Nixon administration, once again tackling this as a moral and thus Christian issue. Beyond the direct effects of his policy, Reagan gave Americans a sense of security and hope once again. The crisis of confidence was seemingly over, and internationally America's enemies were feeling the pressure of an aggressive American war and intelligence machine. Cuba was kept at bay in Latin America, the Soviets were forced to retreat from Afghanistan and were now on the verge of collapse, and the new anti-Western forces of the Middle East were being suppressed. But Reagan's policies came with a double edge for the very people he intended to help. Rural Christian communities suffered a decrease in economic opportunity as the globalization of the American economy forced them to compete with foreign markets. For agricultural and resource-producing communities, this was nearly a death sentence, and once again rural America suffered a hollowing out of their population and finances. The destitution caused by this would ultimately allow the drug crisis to take root in rural areas across the country. Suburban communities, especially in America's industrial states, were also hit hard by economic globalization, with many industries offshoring their manufacturing to countries where labor was far cheaper, or shutting down entirely as they stood unable to compete with foreign counterparts. Much like agriculture, manufacturing now also began to shed excess labor as automation allowed companies to produce more with fewer employees, producing an outward appearance of financial health for the country as production and GDP appeared to increase, while internally many suffered income loss or outright job loss as a result of these policies. Beyond this, Reagan's small government approach had all but neutered any effective regional calls for mass reform, having intertwined the concept of small government with freedom and American conservatism, while the use of federal power became tainted as a slippery slope toward communism. The result of this would ultimately be a federal government which was domestically lethargic and ineffective, but highly proactive in foreign affairs, something which would later lead many Americans to feel as though the government no longer represented the American people. By 1988, Reagan had thoroughly changed the dynamic of the United States, and while this high would linger some time longer, especially following the fall of the USSR, the supposedly restored American dream was about to reveal itself to be nothing more than an illusion. In 1989, Reagan would be succeeded by his vice president and former director of the CIA, George H.W. Bush. Bush, like Reagan, was a strong believer in small government and foreign interventionism, placing a greater emphasis on foreign humanitarianism in a similar vein to Carter. He was of the persuasion that the totalitarian era was passing and that the United States would soon be the sole superpower and a model for the world over, shaping the nature of global policy to create a world he believed would be free, democratic, and mutually cooperative, and he believed it was America's responsibility to establish this new world order. Naturally, Bush's administration would be dominated by foreign policy. He would oversee the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the fall of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, and America's shoring up of control in various regions of the world, overthrowing the dictatorship of Panama and intervening against Iraq during their invasion of Kuwait. The Cold War had been won, and now the future belonged to the US to build.
Of the few domestic issues tackled by the Bush administration, economics would likely take the largest share of focus, with Bush attempting to balance the budget and reduce the deficit left by Reagan through the cutting of domestic spending and raising of taxes. Beyond this, Bush would also take on social issues, signing into law the Americans with Disabilities Act and Civil Rights Act of 1991, the former of which extended civil rights protections to the disabled, while the latter of which allowed employees the right to sue for discrimination or harassment. Additionally, Bush would reform the Hart-Celler Immigration Act in 1990 by expanding the total number of legal immigrants who could arrive in the U.S. each year, creating both new categories for work-based visas and the immigration lottery system to bring in immigrants from countries whose populations were deemed underrepresented in America, further establishing temporary protected status visas for individuals whose home countries were experiencing crisis. This would result in one of the largest spikes of immigration in American history, maintaining a continuous inflow nearly equal to that of the immigration wave experienced during the early 20th century, yet continuing over a longer span of time, possibly making it the beginning of the single largest immigration wave in all of American history. Bush's efforts to balance the national budget by raising taxes, as well as to a much lesser extent an unexpected third-party challenge from Ross Perot, whose platform ran contrary to the newly emerging establishment, would ultimately be what cost Bush a victory in the 1992 election and allowed Southern liberal Democrat Bill Clinton to take the presidency. Clinton would be to the Democrats what Reagan had been for the Republicans, a figure who would have the ideology and circumstances to shape a new future for their party in line with the dominant American ideology of the day, a globalist laissez-faire ideology. In this sense, Bill Clinton was the first true Democrat of this era, much as Reagan was the first true Republican of this era, with Nixon and Carter having merely been transitional steps from their New Deal counterparts. Clinton had inherited the post-Cold War high and had campaigned on what he called his third way, or what others have called triangulation. It was a platform that, like Reagan's neoconservatism, promised small government, a balanced budget, and personal freedom, but now placed a greater emphasis upon equality, environmentalism, and social welfare. Thus was born modern neoliberalism, Reagan-esque right-wing economics paired with left-wing social policy, and of course the overarching focus on global affairs. While Bush would be the first president to oversee the post-Cold War world, Clinton would be the first president to truly capitalize upon it. During his 2 terms of leadership, Clinton would simultaneously create a new era of good feelings, but also an age of domestic unrest among various populations who, now with the threat of the Cold War behind them, turned back toward internal circumstances and what increasingly seemed like a neglecting of domestic issues by the establishment. For many who grew up in the 2000s, it had been Clinton who defined the political character of what they would recognize as contemporary America, as despite his presidency having ended in 2001, Clinton-style neoliberalism would continue to dominate policy for at least the next decade. Under Clinton, America's global involvement would increase with the official signing of NAFTA, which created a free trade area between the US, Canada, and Mexico. China was granted most favored nation status by the United States, nearly doubling Chinese imports to the US in a 5-year span of time, with massive increases in the years following, something which would deal a final killing blow to many remaining domestic American industries, which had already been declining gradually as the service-based economy emerged. Clinton had also guided China into joining the World Trade Organization, which Clinton had hoped would incentivize China to liberalize but only dramatically increase the reach of the Chinese economy. It would be in this decade that the events of the Rodney King riots, Ruby Ridge standoff, Waco siege, and Oklahoma City bombings would take place, the former of which represented a new breaking point in national race relations with an increased focus upon law enforcement. The riots would leave the city of LA with over $1 billion in property damage, seeing over 60 deaths and some 2,300 injuries. Unlike prior race riots which produced few direct gains for the black community, the Rodney King riots would lead to immediate concessions from the city of LA, which awarded Rodney King a massive financial settlement and penalized its police department with calls for resignation and reform. The widespread news coverage of this riot and the results it had would inspire future responses to struggles with law enforcement from the black community. The latter events of Ruby Ridge and Waco would signal a crashing of American trust in federal authority, with government agents being implicated in the escalation of the 2 occurrences, which began as arrest attempts and resulted in the deaths of multiple innocents. The Oklahoma City bombing would occur as a direct response from Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who became radicalized by the coverage of these events, coming to believe that the federal government was slowly stripping away the constitutional rights of its citizens. It would be during this same time that the American militia and constitutionalist movements began to grow in prominence, as would the prevalence of lone wolf domestic terrorists, further inspired by figures like the Unabomber and Eric Rudolph, who used terrorism to promote or advance their personal ideologies. In response to this and perceived threats from abroad, Clinton would enact policy aimed at studying and countering terrorist groups, both foreign and domestic, with it ultimately being concluded that most domestic militias posed little threat given their reactive nature, in comparison to foreign terrorist organizations which were proactive, actively plotting attacks such as the 1993 World Trade Center bombing.
Later in the decade, the Columbine school shooting would begin an expanding of federal scrutiny to emotionally or mentally troubled youth, something which was seemingly growing in prevalence and which officials correctly guessed would result in additional similar shootings as years progressed, though officials have repeatedly failed to hone in on precise causes, which in turn resulted in multiple moral panics surrounding violent media. Clinton would continue in further Bush's spending cuts and tax raises in an effort to balance the budget, eventually succeeding in achieving a budget surplus in 1998, the first of its kind in decades. Clinton would also see to taking on more environmentalist endeavors, something which Bush had previously re-explored with his Clean Air Act and which Reagan had largely sidelined following Nixon and Carter's administrations. Where Clinton broke most significantly with his neoconservative counterparts was on social issues. Clinton would take up the cause of expanding rights for the LGBT community, allowing them to serve in the military under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell compromise, as well as compromising on the Defense of Marriage Act, which, while regarded as having negatively impacted the LGBT community, was actually a strategic compromise which prevented the proposal and likely passing of a constitutional amendment which would have perpetually outlawed gay marriage nationwide, unlike the Defense of Marriage Act, which allowed for state flexibility and which Clinton believed would eventually be overturned. Clinton would also take action to secure access to abortions by revoking and vetoing policies which restricted the practice, along with passing the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. Foreign interventions would continue, particularly within the Balkans during the Yugoslav Wars, Clinton overseeing the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, while in the Middle East an effort to suppress terrorism and the rise of al-Qaeda was underway. Clinton further sought to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, warning that he was a threat to global peace and a sponsor of global terrorism. This would lead to the passing of the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998, which outlined regime change as an American priority. In Eastern Europe, NATO was expanded and Russia under Boris Yeltsin was courted by Clinton toward democratization and liberalization, though tensions between the countries soon emerged. North Korea became a state of focus once it became suspected that the country was building a nuclear arsenal. Clinton would participate in peace talks between the UK and Ireland to bring an end to the Troubles via the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, an American intervention in Somalia would end in disaster when US helicopters were shot down in Mogadishu, leading to the death of 18 soldiers in the battle that followed. Clinton's reputation would ultimately be sullied by a sex scandal between himself and White House intern Monica Lewinsky, the fallout of which led to 2 articles of impeachment as he had denied the accusations, leading to the charge that he had provided false testimony and was thus guilty of perjury and obstruction. However, Clinton would be acquitted and remain in office until 2001, being succeeded by the son of his predecessor, George W. Bush. Bush came into office with a vision of what he called compassionate conservatism. Like Clinton, he sought compromise between the left and right, producing a platform not too different from that of his predecessor, with exceptions in regard to social and religious issues, challenging abortion policies and later reviving the idea of a federal marriage amendment. In line with his predecessors, Bush would also expand free trade significantly, opening free trade arrangements between the US and several countries in the span of his 2 terms. The defining characteristic of Bush's presidency, however, as was the theme for every administration of this era, would be his foreign policy focus. It would be during his term that the deadly September 11th attacks would occur, effectively ending the post-Cold War era of good feelings and driving a massive response from Bush in what became the War on Terror, a war which Bush's Vice President Dick Cheney would have an exceptionally active role in shaping, pushing the administration to invade not only Afghanistan but to finally pursue regime change in Iraq on the grounds that Iraq had been developing weapons of mass destruction, weapons which in reality never existed. The declaration of a new Bush doctrine had taken the ideology of this era to its natural conclusion, that, quote, the survival of liberty in our land depends on the success of liberty in other lands, emphasizing an intention to eradicate anti-democratic and anti-liberal ideology across the globe to protect what Bush and many other neoconservatives and neoliberals recognized as the liberal and democratic values of the United States. While Carter and Nixon had been far cries from one another, by the time of the Bushes and Clinton a largely unified ideology had emerged across both parties, with only slight deviations insofar as social issues were concerned. In later years, this establishment ideology would come to be known particularly among conservatives as the Uniparty, but more commonly would be derided by the respective voters as Republicans in name only for Republicans, or simply not true left-wingers for Democrats. In the years that followed the September 11th attacks, new protocols would be created for holding and interrogating terrorists in government black sites. The Department of Homeland Security was established to enhance security measures nationwide, and the Patriot Act went into effect, allowing the government to surveil suspected terrorists and general communications within the United States. Bush's presidency would be rocked by 2 additional crises, the effects of Hurricane Katrina and a failure of FEMA to appropriately respond to the crisis, as well as the Great Recession. Katrina had represented a very blatant failure of the neoconservative hands-off approach to government, especially in times of crisis. Bush had initially left management of the crisis to state governments not wanting to intervene, and upon recognizing the need for federal aid, went to work with an agency that had been terribly mismanaged since its assimilation into the Department of Homeland Security. The Great Recession in turn represented the hazards brought on by reckless deregulation, globalization, and economic speculation, resulting in the worst financial crisis the country had experienced since the Great Depression, and one which had effects the world over. In an effort to alleviate the crisis, Bush would authorize the Wall Street bailout of 2008, but solving the crisis would take time, and in that time power would fall to a new administration, that of Democrat Barack Obama. Obama would immediately pass a stimulus package to further aid in alleviating the recession, later providing a bailout for automotive manufacturers at risk of bankruptcy. After a year in office, the economy appeared to be in recovery, however the country was once again suffering from a silent crisis of debt and spending. Bush's war on terror and the response of both administrations to the Great Recession had shot government debt up 3/4 of the national GDP. In response to this and the ambitious policy plans of the Obama administration, the debt ceiling would be suspended until the end of Obama's term. Obama would noticeably place a greater focus on domestic issues than his predecessors, but still maintained a focus upon foreign policy, further expanding upon free trade and attempting to pivot away from Middle Eastern affairs to instead focus upon East Asia to challenge what was perceived as the resurgent threats of China and Russia. Since the end of the Cold War and negative publicity received by the CIA for its various covert operations, the United States had sought out new methods of promoting its interests covertly without the use of direct force, and the most effective strategy to emerge in the post-Cold War world was the instigation of color revolutions through independent non-government organizations or NGOs. Through the emergence of mass media and communications, US-funded or supported NGOs would inject themselves into a country of interest, instigate activism and protests, and ultimately, once the time was right, utilize this to pressure the country to adopt change of some sort from a single policy to an entirely new regime. Color revolutions had already proven successful in Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan, which all saw to the installation of pro-Western leaders. With this method seemingly tried and true, it was brought to new areas which the US felt were in need of democratization and liberalization. With Obama eager to pivot away from the highly troubled Middle East and end the war on terror, the idea of stoking pro-democratic change in the region was enticing. The population of the region had already been unsettled by the global effects of the Great Recession and appeared primed to demand change. And so, with the support of the US-funded National Endowment for Democracy, a non-government financial middleman which was founded under Reagan's National Security Decision Directive 77, various NGOs and pro-democracy figures across the Middle East were funded, trained, and coordinated in what ultimately became the Arab Spring, an event which, while motivated by other factors, was absolutely accelerated and reshaped by American desires for change. The results would be far from what the United States desired, however. Civil wars would break out across Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. A massive migrant crisis would result, and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria would emerge as a major terrorist faction which only dragged the US into a deeper Middle Eastern conflict. The overall pivot of the United States from a domestic to foreign policy focus had terrible repercussions both foreign and domestic, and increasingly the public was growing uneasy. The recession would have directly contributed to the emergence of the Occupy movement, whose goal was achieving economic equality and ending corporate influence in politics, soon giving rise to an increasingly anti-capitalist left-wing faction within the Democrat Party. Race-based riots once again became commonplace in an effort by the African American community to extract more concessions and securities from what was increasingly framed as a systemically racist law enforcement system, this view soon branching out to include various other institutions as well. Additionally, LGBT rights were solidified by the landmark court decision to legalize gay marriage nationwide, or rather deem the banning of same-sex marriage unconstitutional. In contrast, a conservative counterpart to such movements did emerge with what was known as the Tea Party movement. However, this was largely engineered by establishment conservatives who want to continue pushing for further decentralization, budget balancing, and vague constitutionalism, while avoiding the social issues which were increasingly taking center stage in the minds of many voters, as social policy would reveal the truly fractured nature of the Republican Party at that point. Americans were growing tired of the obligations of a superpower and tired of a government they felt did not put their interests first, a government which failed to put America first. And so in 2016, given the choice between the wife of the president whose administration represented all that Americans came to resent about this era, and a political outsider who promised to break from the establishment, end foreign intervention, and make America great again, the public voted for the latter. But still, the future would remain unclear. America was in fact preparing for its next great change, but what precisely that would be, and whether it would begin here, is too early to tell.
The United States has undergone 7 great ages: the Age of the Federalists, the Age of the Jeffersonians or Democratic Republicans, the Democratic Age, the Republican Age, the Progressive Age, the Age of the New Deal, and the Neo or New Age. One might also simplify these into 3 epochs, 3 timeframes which saw to the evolution of 3 distinct ideologies. Now America stands at the crossroads of another great change, the beginning of another age, another era which is breaking with the interventionist, neoconservative, neoliberal establishment, but what precisely America is becoming is not entirely clear, but there are several hints. It's tempting to look at Donald Trump's break with the establishment and say here is the new direction in which America will be moving. However, there are a number of additional trends to consider before we make this final judgment, trends which would suggest that the future of the United States will not swing back in a conservative direction as many believe, but that it will become more liberal and more democratic. Firstly is the trend of democratization. Putting aside the swing of economic policy, the history of the United States has been one of constant democratization, expanding political power to those who lack it. The nation envisioned by men like Washington, Hamilton, and Marshall was not a democratic nation in the sense that we would interpret the word today. The Federalists desired a country ruled by a moral and patriotic elite, an aristocracy of virtue. The Jeffersonians believed that power should rest in the hands of landed men who owned a physical stake in the country and were thus self-sufficient as to not rely on the government. The Democrats believed that all free white men should be free to vote, regardless of their wealth. The Republicans, of course, expanded the franchise to all male citizens regardless of race. The Progressives expanded the right to women. New Dealers made the concept of fighting for democracy beyond America's borders a staple of American belief. And the neoconservatives and neoliberals have since sought to both democratize abroad and reduce the barriers for participation in the United States as much as possible, to the point that some cities and municipalities in the US have attempted to open voting rights to non-citizens. Use of mail-in ballots have become widespread, talks of lowering the voting age even further have become commonplace across several states, and politicians commonly challenge the concept of requiring legal identification to vote. Democratization has been and may very well remain a mainstay of American politics, which, if that is the case, would prevent any conservative faction from making political progress. But we're also faced with the question of how far can this go? In recent years there has been significant backlash to increased democratization, and so there have emerged arguments to the contrary, talks of raising the voting age, requiring testing to vote, limiting voting to 1 vote per family household instead of per individual, and some states have even amended their constitutions to explicitly require citizenship to vote. Democratization is likely to become a key issue in the immediate future, as it will be one of the fundamental irreconcilable differences between Republicans and Democrats, greatly favoring one over the other. This would also translate to international democratism, which has already been challenged by Donald Trump's rolling back of American foreign participation, and which future Republicans may take an even harder stance on. Secondly is the trend of liberalization, which does in part go hand in hand with democratization. American social values have largely grown more tolerant, progressive, and liberal over time, and understandably so. As the country becomes more well-to-do and issues of need were alleviated, the kind of conservatism and caution based in matters of survival and protecting various traditions or institutions vanished, being replaced by an idealistic social radicalism which, having identified a period of plentiful as a baseline, questions why things cannot be made better and lashes out when the quality of life falls below that baseline. Simply put, the radicalism or desire for change is much stronger on the side of the left than it is for the right. The American left has recognized the current system as unsatisfactory for one reason or another, and will go to extreme lengths to change that, whereas the American right wants to conserve a rapidly eroding status quo which, while they are unsatisfied with it, are comfortable enough to continue within it. The political transformations and alignments of the youngest generation are what will determine if America continues down a course of liberalization, as it will be these generations that have and very well might continue to endure a decline in the American standard of living before things improve. In this regard, the left holds a firmer grip over a larger contingent of the youth population. However, the American right is also seeing the emergence of a more radical than conservative youth population, radical in the sense of opposing the status quo and seeking to change it significantly. Thirdly is the trend of immigration and national power. The Hispanic population is already on course to comprise at least a quarter of the total US population by 2050, and is the second fastest growing minority population in the US, second only to Asians, who comprise a much smaller percentage of the population. Given historic immigration and political trends, this Hispanic population will likely constitute a major, if not one of the leading political forces in the country in a matter of years, with its power concentrated in the Southwest, perhaps in Texas, California, or Arizona. At present, the Hispanic American population favors the Democrat Party by a 2-to-1 margin, though this is skewed by the party's pro-democratization and pro-immigration positions likely to lose favor as Hispanics settle in as a population with roots and institutions in the Southwest, or at least that's what the Republican Party would argue. What we are seeing is that much as with the general youth population, many later generational Hispanic Americans are continuing to support left-wing policy, with those who do not falling into two general categories: a population of moderately conservative, assimilated and typically Protestant Hispanics, and a more radical right-wing Catholic faction. The politics of the Hispanic American population are likely to evolve, however, given present trends would still appear to favor the American left over the right, placing a higher emphasis on issues relating to government services and economic equality. Fourthly, largely Democratic populations are expanding out from urban areas to suburban and rural communities, eroding the conservative stranglehold over these areas. This has been driven by both the expansion of urban areas and by urban populations seeking a lower cost of living. We're also seeing a transplanting of northern and western urban populations to southern cities through both a seeming reversal of the Great Migration and on account of a perception of greater economic opportunities in these southern cities, tilting these largely red states further and further blue, as in the case of Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. The conservative hold over crucial states like Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, and Ohio are terribly narrow for what should be reliable strongholds, none breaking over 55% support in the 2020 election. These are the states with the highest number of individual electoral votes that Republicans can realistically expect to swing their direction, with the exceptions of Pennsylvania and Michigan, and the fact is that every one of those states, with the exception of Texas for the time being, are swing states. What this means is that the states that the Republican Party depends the most upon are among the states whose politics are most vulnerable to change as the demographics shift. As trends stand, if the Republican Party doesn't follow through with its ideological transformation, it will become utterly incapable of winning future elections. Those are the trends working against the American right, but there are also general trends that we can expect to see across both parties regardless of who dominates politics. Firstly, the United States will begin to withdraw from its role as a global hegemon. As we stated in the conclusion of our last 7 Ages of America video, the American public has grown tired of the obligations of a superpower, and whether on the right or left, younger generations are seeking an end to America's foreign policy focus and a return to a domestic focus. The American right has adopted a more extensive stance on this matter, but on the left too there are concerns over American wealth and energy being spent abroad instead of at home to tackle domestic issues, especially as younger generations struggle with the expenses of housing, healthcare, education, and more, even despite a slight resurgence in foreign interest in response to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Hispanic Americans also factor into this, with foreign policy being ranked among the lowest concerns of this demographic. Secondly, the United States will abandon the small government approach to power and become more internally interventionist. Faced with mounting issues that neither side is truly taking the initiative to solve, the youngest generations of both parties largely agree that Reagan and Clinton-style hands-off policies have failed and demand a more activist government that will enforce order and regulation, whether that be on policies like gun control and environmentalism, or on tariffs and cracking down on crime. Whatever side ends up in charge, the United States will see greater participation from the federal government in a fashion unseen since the Progressive and New Deal eras. Thirdly, the United States will see a revitalization of domestic production and the further development of infrastructure. Already, presidents from both parties have agreed upon the need to bring back American manufacturing from overseas, restore energy independence, and expand national infrastructure systems. Though that being said, both the American right and left have differing visions on what precisely that will look like and entail. The neglecting of domestic matters during the Neo-Era have left the United States to fall behind other countries in many regards, including the quality of our buildings and infrastructure. Many who have grown up with these outdated systems and sense an overall stagnation in the growth of the country demand modernization and innovation, transportation systems that are fast, efficient, and wide-reaching, roads and buildings that are well-maintained, public buildings that are sturdy, functional, and beautiful, access to modern essentials like electricity, phone, and internet service. Beyond this, Americans are tired of relying on foreign countries for essential products and resources, especially when those countries are potentially hostile or risk dragging the country into foreign conflicts. Because of this, the country will begin weaning itself off of foreign imports and resources and begin redeveloping domestic manufacturing and resource extraction. Simply put, what this all translates to is that the United States, regardless of which party holds dominance over the next several years, will gradually begin moving towards self-focus and self-sufficiency once again. with this serving as the unifying ideology of this newly emerging era. Though that being said, the drive for this is particularly more pronounced on the American right, and there are still significant deviations in the social ideology of both parties, with a strong likelihood that it will be the social ideology of the Democrat Party that dominates in this era given past trends. That is of course purely hypothetical, and it will take some years before it's clear which party will dominate, but it does seem that this will be the direction the country moves in. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.